Have you ever looked up at the night sky, at the great, silent sweep of the stars, and felt that you were looking at something more than just distant suns? The ancient Greeks certainly did. For them, every constellation was a character, every star a chapter in a grand, cosmic story of love, loss, and transformation. Tonight, we'll be exploring those stories, and how the passions of the gods have left their immortal mark on the world, and on us. So find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let your mind drift back to a time when the world was young. If these stories have brought you a measure of peace and wonder, we would be so grateful if you would consider subscribing to our channel. It allows us to continue creating these quiet spaces for you to rest and dream, and it helps other people who might be looking for a peaceful story to find this video. Before the first sunrise, before the first tear was shed, before the first heart was broken, there was not silence. Silence is an absence, a space where sound used to be. This was something else entirely. This was chaos. Not chaos in our sense of the word, not a state of disorder or confusion, but a great, yawning void, a chasm of infinite potential. Imagine a breath held without lungs, a darkness that was not the opposite of light, but the condition before light had ever been conceived. It was a quiet so profound that it contained everything and nothing, a vast, formless, peaceful emptiness, waiting for the first stirrings of a universe that was still only a dream. This was the womb of possibility, a gentle, slow-moving mist of all that could ever be, holding no shape, no time, no purpose. It simply was. From within this patient, limitless void, the first impulse of creation stirred. It was not a violent big bang, but a slow, gentle unfurling, like a fern opening its fronds in the quiet of a forest floor. The first to emerge from chaos was Gaia, the earth. She was not born, but simply became. She was the foundation, the wide-bosomed mother, the steady, solid ground upon which all of life would eventually stand. She was the cool soil, the deep caves that held no memories, the rolling hills not yet green with grass, and the unclimbed mountains of bare, grey stone. Her rivers were empty channels, her oceans were hollow basins, and her forests were just a thought. And as she came into being, she felt a loneliness, the kind of deep, intrinsic solitude that can only be known by the first living thing. She was a stage without a play, a book without words, and her vastness felt empty. And so she dreamed a companion for herself. From her own essence, without any partner, she brought forth a being equal to herself in majesty, a being that could cover her completely. This was Uranus, the starry sky. He was not a person but a presence, a vast, glittering canopy of potential stars and nascent constellations. He rose up to arch over her, a shimmering blanket of deep blue and silver, studded with the cold fire of distant, unborn suns. And in that moment, the first divine relationship was formed. It was a love born not of passion or desire as we would come to know it, but of a simple, cosmic necessity. It was the love of the earth for the sky that covers it, the love of the ground for the rain that falls upon it. Gaia looked up at the beautiful, star-dusted veil of Uranus, and she loved him. And Uranus looked down upon the green and brown expanse of Gaia, and he loved her in return. Theirs was a passive, perfect union, the first great cosmic balance. The union was constant and complete. The sky lay upon the earth, and from their endless embrace, the first true gods were born. These were not the graceful, human-like Olympians who would later rule the world. These were the Titans, 12 beings of immense power and primal force, each an embodiment of a fundamental aspect of the new world. There was Oceanus, the great, world-encircling river whose waters were the source of all other rivers and seas, a being of constant, steady flow. His sister wife was Tethys, the mother of the springs and clouds, a nurturing presence who fed the world its fresh water. There was Hyperion, the lord of light, the first to hold the concept of the sun, and his wife Theia, the lady of shimmering ether, whose essence gave gold, silver, and gems their divine glint. There was Crius, a titan of the constellations, and Mnemosyne, a quiet goddess who would one day become memory itself, holding all the stories of the world in her mind. There was Iapetus, whose sons would be the ancestors of humankind, and Themis, a titaness of profound wisdom, who represented divine law and the natural order of things. And then there were the two who would change everything. The beautiful golden Rhea, the future mother of gods, whose name meant that which flows, and her brother, the youngest and most ambitious of them all, Kronos, the lord of time, harvest, and fate, his mind as sharp and cold as the metal his mother would one day forge. But Gaia and Uranus's love also produced other, more monstrous children, beings who represented the chaotic, untamed forces of the new creation. First came the three Cyclopes, Brontes, Sterops, and Arges, one-eyed giants who were master craftsmen, their single eye burning with the fire of the forge. They were the embodiment of the storm. Their names meant thunder, lightning, and flash. They could hammer mountains and forge weapons that harnessed the power of the sky. Then came the 3 Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, beings of terrifying strength and overwhelming might. Kotos, Briareos, and Gyges each had 50 heads that could speak with the roar of 100 lions, and 100 powerful arms that could throw mountains as if they were pebbles. They were the personification of the earthquake, the volcano, and the tidal wave. Uranus looked upon these monstrous children with fear and disgust. They were not the perfect, starry beings he had envisioned. They were chaotic, ugly, a stain upon his perfect sky. He saw in their raw power a threat to his own dominion, and so, in an act of terrible, fearful cruelty, he refused to let them see the light. As soon as they were born, he pushed them back into the womb of Gaia, hiding them away in the deepest, darkest pits of the earth, in a place called Tartarus, a dungeon as far beneath the earth was beneath the sky. Gaia felt this cruelty as a physical pain, a constant, agonizing pressure within her own body. Her monstrous children, whom she loved for their strength and their wildness, were imprisoned within her, and her love for Uranus began to curdle into resentment. The constant weight of his presence, once a comforting embrace, now felt like a suffocating prison. The sky had become a tyrant, and so a new feeling entered the cosmos, born from a love that had been betrayed. The cold, hard desire for vengeance. The earth itself groaned under the strain, and from that groan a plan was formed. From deep within herself, from the very core of her being, Gaia brought forth a new element, a pale, grey, unyielding metal, harder than anything that had existed before. This was adamantine. From this metal, she fashioned the first weapon ever made, a great, curved sickle with a jagged edge, a tool that looked like a sliver of a crescent moon, but one that held the promise of terrible violence. She then gathered her 12 Titan children around her, her heart heavy with sorrow and her voice low with conspiracy. She spoke of their father's cruelty, of their monstrous brothers imprisoned in the dark, and of her own unending pain. She held out the great sickle, and asked which of them would dare to stand against their father, to end his reign and free her from her suffering. The Titans were silent, all of them struck with fear. They loved their mother, but Uranus was their father, the all-powerful sky, and the thought of raising a hand against him was terrifying. All were silent except for one. Kronos, the youngest, the one whose heart held a cold ambition that the others lacked, stepped forward. He felt no fear, only a burning resentment for his father, and a desire for the power that he wielded. He took the sickle from his mother's hand, its cold weight feeling right and true. That night, as Uranus descended once more to embrace Gaia, his mind filled with love and his guard completely down, Kronos lay in wait. And as the great sky god lay upon the earth, Kronos struck. With a single, terrible swing of the adamantine sickle, he unmanned his father, severing his connection to the earth forever. Uranus let out a cry of agony and shock that echoed through the cosmos, and he pulled away from Gaia, rising up into the highest heavens, never to lie upon the earth again. The reign of the sky was over. From the terrible wound, drops of blood fell down upon the earth, and from this divine blood, more strange beings were born. From the drops that fell on the land sprang the Erinyes, the Furies, terrifying goddesses of vengeance whose task it would be to hunt down and punish those who spilled family blood. And from the drops that fell into the sea, a great white foam began to gather, and from this foam, a new goddess would one day rise, a goddess whose power would come to define the gods and mortals alike. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, born from the first act of cosmic violence. Kronos, now the victor, cast the sickle into the sea and freed his Titan brothers and sisters. He did not, however, free his monstrous brothers, the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones. He feared their power just as his father had, and so he left them to languish in the darkness of Tartarus. He took the throne of the universe for himself, and chose his sister, the gentle, golden Rhea, to be his queen. Theirs was the second great divine marriage, and it was a love born in the shadow of violence and usurpation. Kronos loved Rhea for her beauty and her grace, and Rhea loved Kronos for his strength and his ambition. But their love could never be pure. It was tainted from the very beginning by the prophecy that Uranus had uttered with his dying breath. That just as Kronos had overthrown his own father, so too would he be overthrown by one of his own children. This prophecy became a poison in Kronos' mind. His love for Rhea was now intertwined with a terrible, gnawing fear. He could not bear the thought of losing his power, of suffering the same fate as his father. And so, as Rhea began to bear him children, the first of a new generation of gods, Kronos' fear drove him to an act of cruelty that rivaled even that of Uranus. One by one, as the beautiful divine children were born, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, Rhea would present them to her husband, her heart filled with a mother's love. And one by one, Kronos, his own heart twisted with paranoia, would take the infants and swallow them whole, imprisoning them within his own body. He believed that if he contained them, they could never rise against him. Rhea's love for Kronos turned to horror and despair. She was trapped in a cycle of birth and loss, forced to watch her beloved children consumed by their own father. Her story was a tragic echo of her mother's, her body once again a prison, though this time it was her husband's belly that held her captive offspring. As she became pregnant with her sixth child, she knew she could not bear to see this one swallowed as well. In desperation, she pleaded with her mother, Gaia, for help. Gaia, who knew all too well the pain of a mother's loss, devised a plan. When the time came for Rhea to give birth, she went to the island of Crete in secret. There, in a deep, hidden cave, she gave birth to her youngest son, a beautiful, bright-eyed baby named Zeus. She then took a large stone, wrapped it in swaddling clothes, and presented it to Kronos. The Titan king, blinded by his fear, did not notice the deception. He took the swaddled stone and swallowed it whole, believing he had once again thwarted his destiny. And so, the seeds of both love and violence, planted at the very beginning of time, had now come to full flower. The love of Gaia for Uranus had led to the birth of the world, but his cruelty had led to his downfall. The love of Kronos for Rhea was real, but it was corrupted by a fear that turned him into a monster. And now, hidden away on a remote island, a new god was growing to manhood, a god who would be fueled by a righteous anger and a desire to free his captive siblings. The quiet of the cosmos was over. The stage was now set for a new war, a new love, and a new generation of gods who would rule from the heights of Mount Olympus. Their passions, their jealousies, and their desires would not be the slow, cosmic unions of the past. They would be sharp, bright, and dangerous, and they would tear the world apart, only to remake it in their own, beautifully flawed image. The war was over. For 10 long years, the universe had trembled with the clash of gods and titans. The younger generation, led by the fierce and brilliant Zeus, had fought their parents for control of creation itself. From his throne on Mount Olympus, Zeus had hurled thunderbolts forged by the Cyclopes, their light searing the heavens. From the depths of the earth, the 100-handed ones, freed from their long imprisonment, had thrown mountains as if they were stones. And now, the great titans, including the mighty Kronos who had once ruled all, were defeated, bound in chains of adamantine, and cast down into the gloomy abyss of Tartarus. A new order had come to the world. A deep quiet fell across the cosmos, the kind of quiet that follows a great and terrible storm. The world was now ruled from the cloud-wreathed peaks of Mount Olympus, and at its head sat Zeus, the new king of the gods and men. He was a king born of rebellion and prophecy, a ruler who had known captivity and had fought for his freedom. He was the lord of the sky, the cloud-gatherer, the master of the thunderbolt, and his power was absolute. He divided the world with his two brothers. Poseidon was given dominion over the restless seas, and Hades was made the solemn king of the underworld, the silent realm of the dead. But Zeus held the greatest prize for himself. The wide sky above and the earth below, and supreme authority over all who dwelled within them, both mortal and divine. But a king cannot rule alone. An order to be stable needs not just a king, but a queen. The sky, for all its power, needs the earth to receive its reign. The throne of Olympus felt empty with only one occupant. Zeus, the new master of the universe, needed a wife, a consort who was his equal in power and majesty, a queen to sit beside him and solidify his reign, not just through force, but through the sacred bond of marriage. His eyes fell upon his sister, Hera. She was not a goddess to be taken lightly. Before Zeus had even ascended to his throne, Hera was a queen in her own right. She was a goddess of the heavens, of the clear, starry air of the upper atmosphere. She was a pre-Hellenic goddess, ancient and powerful, worshipped as a symbol of the sky long before the Olympians came to power. She was beautiful, with the large, calm, watchful eyes of a cow, an animal sacred to her, and her white arms were said to be as lovely as the lilies of the field. But her beauty was not soft or yielding. It was a regal, stern and dignified beauty, the beauty of a monarch who knows her own worth. She had watched her brother's rise to power, had seen his ambition and his strength, but she was not easily impressed. She was proud, independent, and she valued her freedom. She had no desire to be just another of Zeus's conquests. If she were to be his, it would have to be on her own terms. Zeus, for his part, was utterly captivated by her. He desired her with all the force of his stormy nature. But Hera resisted his advances. She saw the wildness in his eyes, the untamed power that refused to be bound by any single loyalty. She knew that to give in to him would be to risk her own sovereignty. So Zeus, the master of the universe, found that his power was useless against the will of his sister. He could command the lightning, but he could not command her heart. And so, the great king of the gods resorted to deception, a trick born of a strange and cunning tenderness. He knew that Hera, for all her pride, had a deep well of compassion. She was a protector of the innocent, a guardian of the natural order. One spring day, as Hera was walking alone on the slopes of Mount Thornax, a great storm broke across the sky. The winds howled, and a cold, driving rain began to fall. Hera took shelter beneath a tree, and as she waited for the storm to pass, she heard a pitiful chirping sound. A small cuckoo, its feathers drenched and ruffled, its body trembling with cold and fear, fluttered down from the sky and collapsed at her feet. Hera's heart was moved by the sight of the distressed little bird. She gently picked it up, cradled it in her hands, and held it close to her breast, whispering soft words of comfort and warming it with her own divine heat. And as the bird grew warm and safe in her embrace, it suddenly transformed. The small, trembling creature grew into the mighty, majestic form of Zeus himself. He had used his power to make himself small and vulnerable, knowing it was the only way to get past her defenses. Hera was shocked and startled, but she was also trapped. Zeus, holding her in his arms, made her a solemn promise. He would not take her by force. He would make her his wife, his queen, the one and only partner to his throne. He would honor her above all others. Reluctantly, her heart caught between outrage at the trick and a strange, deep-seated affection for the god who had gone to such lengths to win her. She agreed. Their wedding was not a private affair. It was a cosmic event, the Hieros Gamos, or sacred marriage, a ritual that symbolized the fundamental ordering of the new universe. It was the union of the sky god and the earth goddess, a promise of fertility, stability, and peace. The ceremony was said to have taken place on the Isle of Samos, under a sacred Lygos tree, or perhaps on the peak of Mount Ida, shrouded in a golden cloud. All the gods and goddesses were in attendance, bringing gifts to honor the new king and queen. The earth itself celebrated. Gaia, their grandmother, gave Hera the most precious gift of all, a tree that bore apples of pure gold, a symbol of eternal life and fertility. This tree was planted in a secret garden at the far western edge of the world, a garden that would come to be known as the Garden of the Hesperides, and it was a testament to the hope and promise of this sacred union. For a time, their marriage was a golden age. Their love was passionate and all-consuming, and the order they created on Olympus was reflected in the world below. The seasons were regular, the harvests were bountiful, and the world knew a peace it had not known since the first days of creation. But the nature of Zeus was the nature of the sky. The sky cannot be contained. The rain must fall on all the earth, not just one garden. And so, the peace of their marriage began to fracture. The solemn vow that Zeus had made to Hera began to fray, stretched thin by his restless desires and his wandering eye. The king of the gods began to look down from Olympus, and his gaze fell upon the beautiful goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women below. And one by one, he betrayed his queen. The first great betrayal was with the Titaness Leto. Zeus fell in love with her gentle beauty and pursued her, and she became pregnant with his children. When Hera discovered the affair, her rage was absolute. This was not just a personal heartbreak, it was a political and theological crisis. Leto was carrying a potential heir, a child of Zeus who could one day challenge the legitimacy of Hera's own children. Her response was swift and terrible. She laid a curse upon Leto, declaring that no land under the sun would be allowed to give her shelter to give birth. She then sent the great serpent Python to hunt the pregnant Titaness across the face of the earth. Leto wandered for months, her body heavy with child, finding no place to rest. Every island, every mountain, every city turned her away, terrified of Hera's wrath. Finally, the small, floating, barren island of Delos, which was not technically anchored to the sea floor, and thus not land under the sun, took pity on her. It was there, clinging to a sacred palm tree, that Leto gave birth to the twin gods, Artemis and Apollo, two of the most powerful and beautiful of the new Olympian generation. Hera's attempt to prevent their birth had failed, but her persecution of Leto became the first dark chapter in the long, tragic story of her jealousy. Hera's vengeance was not always so direct. She was a cunning strategist, her mind as sharp as her anger. When Zeus fell in love with Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes, Hera plotted a more subtle and devastating revenge. She disguised herself as an old, trusted nurse and befriended the young princess. She listened as Semele boasted of her divine lover, and then, with feigned concern, she planted a seed of doubt in the girl's mind. How could she be sure, the old woman asked, that her lover was truly Zeus and not some monster in disguise? The only way to be certain, Hera suggested, was to make him swear an unbreakable oath by the river Styx to grant her one wish, and then to wish for him to reveal himself in his true, divine form. Semele, young and foolish, fell for the trick. She extracted the oath from Zeus and then made her fatal request. Zeus was horrified. He begged her to choose another wish, knowing that no mortal could survive the sight of his divine glory, the raw, unfiltered power of the thunder god. But the oath was sworn, and he was bound to it. He appeared before her in a blaze of lightning and thunder, and the poor mortal girl was instantly incinerated, consumed by the very glory she had longed to see. Zeus managed to save their unborn child, Dionysus, by sewing him into his own thigh, but Semele was lost forever, a victim of Hera's cruel ingenuity. Perhaps the most famous story of Hera's wrath is that of Io, a priestess who served in Hera's own temple. When Zeus fell for the beautiful priestess, he tried to hide his affair by covering the earth in a thick blanket of dark clouds, but the sudden darkness was suspicious. Hera descended from Olympus to investigate, and Zeus, in a panic, transformed Io into a beautiful white heifer to disguise her. Hera was not fooled. She looked at the cow, praised its beauty, and then casually asked her husband for it as a gift. Zeus could not refuse without revealing his guilt. He handed the cow over to his wife, and Hera's revenge began. She assigned her most trusted servant, Argus Panots, the all-seeing giant with 100 eyes, to guard the heifer. Argus never slept. At any given time, only 2 of his eyes would be closed, while the other 98 remained open and watchful. Io was trapped, forced to live as a cow, eating bitter grass and drinking from muddy streams, unable to speak or explain her plight. Zeus, seeing her misery, sent his clever son Hermes to free her. Hermes, disguised as a shepherd, lulled the great giant to sleep by playing a reed pipe and telling him endless, boring stories. Once all 100 of Arcus's eyes were closed, Hermes slew him. But even this did not end Io's suffering. Enraged by the death of her servant, Hera sent a vicious gadfly to sting and torment the poor heifer, driving her mad and forcing her to wander endlessly across the world, from Europe to Asia, until she finally found refuge in the land of Egypt. Hera's rage was not just reserved for Zeus's lovers. It was often directed with even greater force at his illegitimate children. Her lifelong persecution of the hero Heracles is the ultimate testament to her unyielding grudge. Heracles, the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene, was a living symbol of her husband's greatest infidelity. Hera's hatred for him began before he was even born and continued until his death. She sent 2 venomous snakes to his crib when he was just an infant, only to be astonished when the baby hero simply laughed and strangled them, 1 in each hand. As he grew into the strongest man in the world, her attacks became more insidious. It was Hera who drove him into a fit of madness, causing him to kill his own beloved wife and children. The famous 12 labors of Heracles were his penance for this terrible act, a quest for redemption from a crime that Hera herself had orchestrated. She hounded him at every turn, sending monsters and raising obstacles, her hatred a constant shadow over his heroic life. It would be easy to see Hera as nothing more than a jealous, vengeful shrew, but to do so is to misunderstand her. She was the goddess of marriage, of the sacred vow, of fidelity and commitment. Her entire domain was the institution that her husband, the king of the gods, publicly and repeatedly violated. His affairs were not just personal insults, they were attacks on the very foundation of her power and her reason for being. Her rage, from her perspective, was righteous. It was the fury of a queen whose authority was constantly being undermined, the anger of a goddess whose most sacred principles were being mocked by the one person who should have upheld them. She was not always the aggressor. In one famous story, her patience finally snapped. She conspired with Poseidon and Athene to overthrow her husband. They managed to drug him, and as he slept, they bound him with unbreakable chains, taking his thunderbolts from him. For a moment, the king of the gods was a helpless prisoner, but Thetis, a sea nymph loyal to Zeus, summoned the 100-handed Briareos from the depths of Tartarus, and his mighty arms easily untied the knots, freeing the enraged Zeus. His vengeance on Hera was swift. He hung her from the highest peaks of Olympus, with golden chains around her wrists and heavy anvils tied to her feet. She wept in pain for a whole day and night, until Zeus, his anger cooled, finally relented and freed her, making her promise never to rebel against him again. And so they remained, locked in this eternal, turbulent embrace. Their marriage was the central axis around which the Olympian world turned. It was a union of opposites, a constant, roiling storm of passion, betrayal, rage, and a strange, resilient tenderness. Their quarrels were terrifying, shaking the foundations of the world and causing immense suffering for the mortals caught in their crossfire. But their reconciliations brought peace and fertility. Their relationship was a reflection of the Greek understanding of the world itself, a place of both beautiful, rational order and wild, unpredictable chaos. They were the king and queen of the heavens, forever bound by a love that was forged in deception, tempered by betrayal, and destined to last for all eternity. Their story is not a simple romance. It is a grand, sweeping tragedy, a love built on thunder, a permanent storm at the very heart of the divine. After the great violence of the beginning, after the sky had been separated from the earth and time itself had swallowed its own children, the world began to settle. The oceans, which had churned with the blood of a wounded god, grew calm. And on the gentle, lapping waves near the island of Cythera, a miracle began to take shape. A great, white, shimmering foam, born from the immortal essence of Uranus and the salt of the sea, started to gather. It was a foam whiter than milk, more radiant than a pearl, and from its center, something new was rising. She was not born in the way that others were, from a mother's womb. She simply emerged, fully formed, from the loving embrace of the sea. This was Aphrodite, and her arrival was the moment that beauty itself entered the world. She rose from the waves, standing on a great scalloped shell that served as her chariot. Her hair, the color of spun gold, cascaded down her back, and from its wet strands, drops of water fell like diamonds into the sea. Her skin was as smooth and pale as alabaster, and her eyes held the deep, mysterious blue-green of the ocean depths. As the gentle west wind, Zephyrus, saw her, he was so overcome by her loveliness that he breathed a soft, warm sigh, guiding her shell towards the shore of Cyprus. As her feet touched the land for the first time, green grass and vibrant flowers sprang up in her footsteps. She was not just beautiful, she was beauty itself, a living, breathing embodiment of all that was graceful, lovely, and desirable. The Houri, the goddesses of the seasons, rushed to meet her. They clothed her in divine, shimmering garments that seemed woven from moonlight. They placed a golden diadem upon her head, and they hung precious jewels in her ears and around her neck. And then they led her to the home of the gods, to the peaks of Mount Olympus. When Aphrodite entered the great hall of the gods, a hush fell over the assembly. The mighty Olympians, who had witnessed the birth of the cosmos and fought wars that shook the foundations of the world, were utterly silenced by her presence. Zeus, the king of the gods, looked upon her and saw a power that could rival his own thunderbolts. Poseidon, the lord of the sea, felt the oceans in his heart grow still with awe. Apollo, the god of music and light, found that his own radiance seemed dim in comparison. And Ares, the fierce god of war, felt his warrior's heart beat with a new and unfamiliar rhythm, a rhythm not of battle, but of pure, unadulterated longing. They had never seen anything so perfect. Her beauty was a force of nature, a divine power that could inspire instant, overwhelming love in anyone who gazed upon her. Zeus, in his wisdom, saw the danger immediately. This goddess, this creature of foam and starlight, was so desirable that she would tear Olympus apart. The gods would fight for her, their rivalries plunging the new, fragile order back into the chaos from which it had just emerged. He knew he had to act, to contain this new, beautiful and dangerous power. And so, he made a decision that was both politically astute and breathtakingly cruel. He would give Aphrodite in marriage, not to the most handsome or the most powerful of the gods, but to the one who posed the least threat, the one who was least likely to inspire jealousy. He chose his own son, Hephaestus, the god of the forge. Hephaestus was the great craftsman of the gods, the master of fire and metal. It was he who had forged Zeus's mighty thunderbolts, Poseidon's trident, and the invisible helmet of Hades. His skill was unparalleled, his creations things of wonder and power. But Hephaestus himself was not beautiful. He had been born with a lame leg and a weak constitution. His own mother, Hera, had been so ashamed of his imperfection that she had cast him from the heights of Olympus down into the sea. He had been rescued and raised by sea nymphs, and had spent his youth in a hidden grotto, perfecting his craft. He was a god of immense talent, but he was also a figure of ridicule on Olympus. He was soot-stained and graceless, his powerful arms and shoulders a stark contrast to his crippled leg. He was the god of making beautiful things, but he himself was not beautiful. And it was to this god, the lame, the mocked, the hard-working craftsman, that Zeus gave the hand of Aphrodite, the goddess of perfect, effortless beauty. Their marriage was a union of the most profound opposites. It was the marriage of the flawless and the flawed, of ethereal grace and earthly toil. Hephaestus, for his part, was overwhelmed with love for his new wife. He could not believe his good fortune. He worshipped her. He built her a magnificent palace on Olympus, filled with wonders. He crafted for her the most exquisite jewelry imaginable. Necklaces that shimmered with the light of captured stars, bracelets that sang with the sound of the sea, and a magical, embroidered girdle, the cestus hemas, that had the power to make its wearer utterly irresistible to all who saw her. He poured all of his skill, all of his devotion, all of his quiet, lowly heart into the gifts he laid at her feet. He hoped that his creations, the beautiful things he could make with his hands, might somehow compensate for the beauty he lacked in his own form. But Aphrodite felt no such love in return. She looked upon her husband with a cool indifference that bordered on contempt. She saw not his skill or his devotion, but only his lame leg, his soot-stained face, his calloused hands. He was a god of work, of sweat and fire and effort. Her beauty was effortless, a gift of her very nature. She felt shackled to him, this creature of perfect grace bound to a creature of imperfection. And so, while Hephaestus twirled in his forge deep within the heart of the volcano Mount Etna, creating wonders for the gods, his beautiful wife sought comfort and passion elsewhere. Her eyes fell upon the one god whose nature was as fiery and untamed as her own, Ares, the god of war. Ares was everything that Hephaestus was not. He was handsome, arrogant, and brutally strong. His heart reveled in the clash of swords, the cries of battle, and the scent of blood. He was the embodiment of physical passion, of aggression, of the wild, untamed fury of conflict. And when he looked at Aphrodite, he saw his perfect counterpart. If he was the fury of war, she was the beautiful, desirable prize for which wars were fought. Their attraction was immediate, primal, and irresistible. It was a love affair born of fire and starlight, a dangerous and passionate union of the two most volatile forces in the universe, love and war. Their affair was a secret that all of Olympus seemed to know, all except for the devoted, hard-working husband toiling in his forge. Ares and Aphrodite would meet in the dead of night, in the palace of Hephaestus, even in the very bed that he had built for his queen. Their passion was reckless. They were so consumed by each other that they grew careless. Their only guard was a young attendant of Ares named Electrian, whose job it was to stand watch and wake them before the sun rose. For the sun god Helios crossed the sky each day in his golden chariot, and his all-seeing eyes missed nothing. He was the one witness who could expose their secret. One fateful morning, the young Electrian, exhausted from a long night of reverie, fell asleep at his post. He did not wake the lovers before dawn. And so, as Helios began his daily journey across the sky, his bright, unwavering light shone down upon the palace of Hephaestus, and illuminated the sight of the god of war and the goddess of love, locked in a passionate embrace in the marriage bed of the god of the forge. Helios, a god of order and truth, was outraged by this betrayal. He flew immediately to Mount Etna and told Hephaestus everything he had seen. Hephaestus listened, and his heart, which had been filled with a quiet, hopeful love, was shattered. The pain of the betrayal was immense, but it was quickly followed by a cold, burning rage. But his was not the explosive, thoughtless fury of Ares. He was a craftsman, a planner, a god who understood that the best revenge is not swift and loud, but patient, intricate, and perfectly executed. He returned to his forge, his mind alight with a terrible new design. He told his wife that he was leaving for a time, to visit the island of Lemnos, his favorite retreat. Aphrodite and Ares, believing themselves to be safe, planned another secret rendezvous. But Hephaestus had not gone to Lemnos. He was in his forge, working with fire and bronze, creating his masterpiece of vengeance. He forged a net, but it was no ordinary net. It was made of links so fine that they were invisible to the naked eye, yet they were as strong and unbreakable as the chains that held the Titans in Tartarus. It was a trap of exquisite, terrible craftsmanship. He secretly hung this invisible net above his marriage bed, with magical chains that would release it at the slightest touch. That night Ares came to Aphrodite's bed, and as they fell into their passionate embrace, they triggered the trap. The invisible net fell upon them, silent and swift, entangling them completely. They were caught, pinned together, unable to move or escape. They were utterly helpless. And then Hephaestus returned. He stood in the doorway of his own bedroom and looked upon his wife and her lover, trapped in their moment of shame. He did not shout or draw a weapon. His revenge was far more humiliating. He threw open the doors of his palace and called out to all the other gods of Olympus. He invited them to come and witness the spectacle, to see how the goddess of beauty and the god of war had dishonored him. The gods assembled, and their reaction was not one of sober judgment, but of divine amusement. Apollo, the god of music, turned to Hermes, the messenger god, and asked him if he would be willing to trade places with Ares, to be trapped in a net so long as he could be with the beautiful Aphrodite. Hermes, with his characteristic wit, replied that he would gladly be bound by 3 such nets, if it meant he could lie beside the golden goddess. The gods roared with laughter. The sound of their mirth echoed through the halls of Olympus. Hephaestus's pain had become a source of entertainment for the heavens. Only Poseidon, the lord of the sea, felt a sense of decorum, and he negotiated Ares's release, promising that the god of war would pay a fine for his adultery. Hephaestus, his point made, finally released the lovers. Ares, humiliated, fled to his homeland of Thrace. And Aphrodite, her cheeks burning with a shame she had never known, retreated to her sacred island of Cyprus, where she bathed in the sea and was restored to her full, radiant beauty by the Graces. But the memory of the laughter, and the shame, would linger. This humiliation did not temper Aphrodite's passions, but perhaps it taught her something about the pain that love could cause. Her next great love affair was not with a powerful god, but with a mortal, and it would end not in laughter, but in tears. He was Adonis, a young prince of Cyprus, a hunter of such breathtaking beauty that he rivaled the gods themselves. Aphrodite saw him, and for the first time, she felt the very power that she wielded over others. Some say that she was accidentally pricked by one of the arrows of her own son, Eros, the mischievous god of desire. Whatever the cause, she fell deeply, desperately in love with the mortal youth. This was a different kind of love for her. It was not the fiery, illicit passion she had shared with Ares. It was a tender, protective, and anxious love. She, the goddess of Olympus, abandoned the heavens to be with her mortal lover. She roamed the forests with him, dressed as a huntress, sharing his life and his passions, but she was consumed by a constant fear. She knew he was mortal, fragile, and that his life was a fleeting thing. She warned him constantly of the dangers of the hunt, begging him not to pursue the great, dangerous beasts of the forest, like the lion and the wild boar. She was afraid of losing him. Her fear, tragically, was well-founded. One day, while hunting, Adonis, full of the confidence of youth, ignored her warnings and pursued a great, wild boar. The beast, enraged, turned on him and gored him in the thigh with its great tusks. Aphrodite, who was in her swan-drawn chariot in the sky, heard the faint sound of his dying groan. She rushed to his side, but it was too late. She held his dying body in her arms, her divine tears falling upon his mortal wound. Her grief was immense, a sorrow so profound that it touched the earth itself. Where the drops of his blood fell upon the soil, the beautiful scarlet anemone flower sprang up, a symbol of a love that was cut short too soon. And from her tears, the world learned a new kind of sorrow, the sorrow of a love that is ended by death. And so, the nature of Aphrodite is revealed. She is not a simple goddess of romance and happy endings. She is a primal force, an embodiment of the irresistible power of beauty and desire. Her love is a spell, a divine gift that can elevate a mortal to the heights of ecstasy or plunge them into the depths of despair. To be loved by Aphrodite is to be touched by a fire that can warm the heart or burn it to ashes. She is the laughter of the gods and the tears of a grieving lover. She is the beauty of the dawn and the violence of her own birth. She is the goddess who can create love with a glance, and ruin lives with the very same power. Her spell is the sweet, dangerous, and eternal magic that drives the world. A magic that promises both heaven and hell, and often delivers both at the same time. In the quiet spaces between the great, thundering passions of the Olympians, there are softer stories, tales that unfold not with the clash of weapons, but with the gentle, aching sigh of a human heart. Our story now turns away from the grand halls of Olympus and down to the mortal world, to a kingdom where a king had 3 daughters. The 2 elder daughters were beautiful, and were married to wealthy princes, their lives happy and content. But the youngest daughter was a miracle. Her name was Psyche, a name that means soul, and her beauty was so profound, so radiant, and so perfect that it seemed to be a thing of heaven, not of earth. Word of her loveliness spread throughout the mortal world. People would travel for miles, not just to see her, but to worship her. They would gaze upon her face and whisper that this, surely, was Aphrodite herself, reborn in human form. Soon, the temples of the true Aphrodite began to fall into neglect. Her altars grew cold, her sacred groves were untended, and the garlands of flowers once offered to her now wilted at the feet of a mortal girl. The prayers and praises that had once risen to the goddess of love on Mount Olympus were now being given to Psyche. On Olympus, Aphrodite watched, and her divine heart filled with a cold and bitter jealousy. She who had been born of the sea foam and the sky, who had silenced the gods with her mere presence, was being upstaged by a mere mortal. Her pride was wounded, and her anger grew into a terrible, cruel resolve. She would not just punish this girl, she would utterly humiliate her. She would use her own divine power, the power of love, as a weapon against her rival. She summoned her son, Eros, the mischievous and often cruel god of desire, known to the Romans as Cupid. He was a winged youth of breathtaking beauty, armed with a golden bow and a quiver of 2 types of arrows. Sharp, golden-tipped arrows that would inflict instant, uncontrollable love, and blunt, lead-tipped arrows that would cause an equally powerful feeling of revulsion. He was his mother's enforcer, a primal force of passion who flew through the world, causing chaos and delight in equal measure. Aphrodite led her son to Psyche's city and pointed out the beautiful girl. Her instructions were simple and vicious. Eros was to use his power to make Psyche fall deeply and wretchedly in love with the most vile, contemptible, and monstrous creature he could find. She was to be consumed by a passion for a being so hideous that her beauty would become a source of mockery and shame for all time. Eros, ever the obedient son, agreed. He took his bow and flew down to the mortal world, cloaked in the invisibility of the night, to carry out his mother's cruel command. He found Psyche's chamber and entered, silent as a moonbeam. He saw her sleeping peacefully in her bed, her face bathed in the soft light of the moon. He drew one of his golden arrows, ready to touch her with its cursed tip. But as he leaned over her, he was so stunned by the sight of her serene and perfect beauty that he drew back in awe. In that moment of hesitation, he accidentally pricked his own thumb with the tip of his arrow. And in that instant, the great god of desire, who had inflicted love upon countless gods and mortals, felt its power for the very first time. He fell completely and irrevocably in love with the sleeping girl. He looked at her, his heart filled with a feeling he had never known, and he knew he could not carry out his mother's command. He gently brushed a stray curl from her forehead, and as he flew away, he silently vowed to protect her. But a strange fate now befell Psyche. Though she was worshipped for her beauty, no man asked for her hand in marriage. Kings and princes came to gaze at her as they would a perfect statue in a temple, but they all went away to marry other, less intimidating women. Her 2 less beautiful sisters were happily married, but Psyche remained alone, a prisoner of her own perfection. Her father, the king, grew desperate. Fearing he had somehow angered the gods, he traveled to the great oracle of Apollo to ask for guidance. The oracle, its voice echoing through the sacred hall, delivered a terrifying prophecy. Psyche, it declared, was not destined for a mortal husband. Her groom was a creature of wings and fire, a monstrous serpent-like being feared by both gods and men. The prophecy commanded that Psyche be dressed in funeral clothes, taken to the peak of a lonely mountain, and left there to be claimed by her monstrous husband. The king and all his people were plunged into grief. The wedding preparations became a funeral procession. Psyche, however, faced her terrible fate with a quiet, sorrowful courage. She calmed her weeping parents, telling them that she was being punished for the very beauty they had all celebrated, and that she would meet her destiny without fear. And so, the entire city escorted her to the lonely mountain peak. They left her there, alone and shivering in the cold wind, and returned to their homes to mourn the daughter they had lost. As Psyche stood on the desolate crag, weeping in the twilight, she felt a sudden, gentle breeze. The west wind, Zephyrus, the same gentle god who had once guided Aphrodite to the shore, had been sent by his master, Eros. The wind wrapped around her like a soft blanket, lifting her from the ground. It carried her gently down from the terrifying peak, and into a deep, sheltered valley, a place of impossible beauty, filled with fragrant flowers and ancient, peaceful trees. Zephyrus set her down upon a bed of soft grass, and exhausted from her grief, she fell into a deep and peaceful sleep. When she awoke, she saw before her a magnificent palace, a structure so grand and beautiful that it seemed to have been built not by human hands, but by the gods themselves. Its walls were of polished gold, its ceilings of carved ivory, and its floors were inlaid with precious stones that depicted all the stories of the world. Hesitantly she entered. The palace was empty, yet it felt alive. As she walked through its silent halls, a voice whispered on the air, welcoming her and telling her that all she saw was hers. Invisible servants attended to her every need. A feast appeared on the table before her, and the music of an unseen lyre filled the air. She was bathed in scented water and clothed in beautiful garments. She was the mistress of this enchanted castle. That night, as she lay in the darkness of her new, luxurious bed, she heard the voice of her promised husband for the first time. He came to her in the complete blackness of the room, and his voice was not monstrous, but gentle, kind, and filled with love. He explained to her that he was the husband the oracle had foretold, and that she was his beloved wife. He treated her with the utmost tenderness and respect, and Psyche, who had been so lonely, found her fear melting away, replaced by a growing affection for this kind, invisible companion. Every night he would come to her, and they would talk for hours, their hearts connecting in the intimate darkness. And every morning, just before the first light of dawn, he would be gone. Psyche fell deeply in love with her mysterious husband. But he had one strict rule: she must never, ever try to see his face. He warned her, his voice filled with a sad urgency, that the moment she looked upon him, their love would be shattered, and she would lose him forever. For a time, Psyche was content. Her days were spent in luxurious solitude, and her nights were filled with the joy of her husband's company. But her solitude began to weigh upon her. She missed her family, and she longed to tell them that she was not dead, but happy. She begged her husband to allow her sisters to visit her. Eros, for it was he, knew the danger. He warned her that her sisters did not have her best interests at heart, and that their visit would bring ruin upon them both. But he loved her too much to deny her anything that would ease her loneliness. He reluctantly agreed, and he commanded Zephyrus to bring her sisters to the enchanted valley. The two sisters were astonished to find Psyche alive and well, and even more astonished by the unimaginable wealth and luxury of her magical palace. But their astonishment quickly turned to a bitter, burning jealousy. They saw Psyche's happiness, they heard her speak of her kind and loving husband, and their own comfortable lives suddenly seemed poor and dull in comparison. They returned to their own homes, their hearts filled with envy, and they began to plot Psyche's downfall. On their next visit, they put their cruel plan into action. They preyed on Psyche's deepest fear, the memory of the oracle's prophecy. They wept false tears of concern for her, telling her that they had learned the truth about her husband. He was, they insisted, the monstrous serpent from the prophecy, and he was only being kind to her to fatten her up before he devoured her and her unborn child. They painted a terrifying picture of her fate, and they gave her a terrible solution. She must, they said, hide an oil lamp and a sharp knife in her room. That night, when her husband was fast asleep, she must light the lamp, look upon the monster, and plunge the knife into its heart. Psyche's mind was thrown into turmoil. She loved her husband, and his kindness and tenderness felt real. But the words of her sisters, combined with the lingering fear of the prophecy, planted a seed of doubt that grew into a terrible, consuming terror. What if they were right? Torn between love and fear, she finally resolved to follow their wicked advice. That night, after Eros had come to her and had fallen into a deep sleep, Psyche, her hands trembling, crept from the bed. She retrieved the oil lamp and the sharp knife she had hidden. Taking a deep breath, she lit the lamp and raised it high, her other hand gripping the cold handle of the knife. The soft, golden light of the lamp flooded the bed, and Psyche gasped. Her hand went limp, and the knife fell harmlessly to the floor. For there before her she saw not a monster, but the most beautiful being she could ever have imagined. It was the god Eros himself, his golden hair spilling across the pillows, his perfect face serene in sleep, and his great, white wings folded peacefully at his sides. His golden bow and his quiver of arrows lay on the floor beside the bed. She was so overcome with love, relief, and awe that she leaned closer to gaze upon his face. And as she did, her trembling hand tilted the lamp, and a single drop of searingly hot oil fell from it, landing directly on his divine shoulder. Eros, jolted awake by the sudden, sharp pain, opened his eyes. He saw the lamp. He saw the knife on the floor, and he saw the look of betrayal and discovery on his wife's face. His own face, which had been so serene in sleep, was now filled with a look of profound and heartbreaking sorrow. He did not shout. He did not rage. He simply looked at her and said, his voice quiet and full of pain, "Oh, foolish Psyche, is this how you repay my love? I who defied my own mother's command for your sake, who made myself your husband when I was meant to be your tormentor. But now you have seen me. Love cannot live where there is no trust." And with those words, he spread his great wings and flew out the window, disappearing into the darkness of the night. As he vanished, the enchanted palace, the beautiful gardens, and all the wonders within it dissolved into thin air, leaving Psyche alone, weeping on the cold, barren ground where it had once stood. Psyche was consumed by grief and remorse. She wandered the earth, searching desperately for her lost love, her soul now truly living up to its name, a spirit in search of its other half. She went from temple to temple, praying to the gods for help, but none would listen, for they all feared the wrath of Aphrodite. Finally, knowing she had no other choice, Psyche went directly to the temple of Aphrodite herself, and with a humble heart, offered herself as the goddess's servant, willing to do anything to atone for her mistake and earn back the love she had lost. Aphrodite, her rage still burning, saw a chance for a final, cruel revenge. She laughed at Psyche's pleas and decided to set her a series of impossible tasks, designed to crush her spirit completely. First she took Psyche to a storehouse and showed her a gigantic, chaotic pile of mixed grains: wheat, barley, millet, poppy seeds, lentils and beans, and commanded her to sort them all into separate, neat piles by nightfall. Psyche, seeing the mountain of grain, simply sat down and wept, her heart overwhelmed by the impossibility of the task. But a small army of ants, taking pity on the poor girl who was so loved by the god of love, came to her aid. Working together, the tiny creatures sorted the entire pile, grain by grain, and when Aphrodite returned at dusk, she found the task perfectly completed. Furious that Psyche had succeeded, Aphrodite devised a second, more dangerous task. She pointed to a flock of vicious, golden-fleeced sheep grazing by a river. These sheep were known to be fierce, and would attack any human who approached them. Psyche was ordered to go and collect a sample of their golden wool. As Psyche approached the river, ready to face certain death, a gentle green reed growing by the bank whispered to her. It advised her not to approach the sheep in the heat of the day, when they were at their most aggressive, but to wait until the evening. Then she could simply gather the tufts of golden wool that the sheep had left caught on the thorny briar bushes as they passed. Psyche followed the reed's advice, and once again, she completed the task and presented the golden fleece to her furious mistress. For the third task, Aphrodite gave Psyche a crystal flask and ordered her to fill it with the deathly black water of the river Styx, which cascaded down from a high, sheer, and inaccessible cliff face, a place guarded by terrifying dragons. As Psyche stared up at the impossible cliff, knowing she could never climb it, the great eagle of Zeus, the king of the gods, suddenly swooped down from the sky. The eagle, remembering a time when Eros had helped him in a moment of need, took the flask from Psyche's hand in its beak, soared up the treacherous cliff face, evaded the dragons, and filled the flask with the black water, returning it safely to her. For her fourth and final task, Aphrodite devised the most terrible challenge of all. She gave Psyche a small, empty box and ordered her to journey to the underworld, the realm of the dead. There she was to present the box to Persephone, the queen of the underworld, and ask her to place within it a small portion of her own divine beauty. As Aphrodite claimed, she had lost some of her own while nursing her heartsick, wounded son. This was, in essence, a death sentence. No mortal could journey to the land of the dead and expect to return. Desperate and seeing no other way, Psyche climbed a high tower, planning to end her suffering by throwing herself from it. But as she stood on the edge, the tower itself spoke to her. It told her not to give up, and it gave her precise and detailed instructions for her perilous journey. It told her to carry 2 coins in her mouth to pay Charon, the spectral ferryman of the dead, for passage across the river Styx, both coming and going. It told her to carry 2 honey cakes in her hands to pacify Cerberus, the savage, free-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades. And it gave her one final, crucial warning. When she received the box from Persephone, she must not, under any circumstances, open it. Psyche followed the tower's instructions perfectly. She paid the ferryman, she pacified the great hound, and she stood before the throne of the solemn queen Persephone. The queen of the dead took pity on the mortal girl and agreed to Aphrodite's request. She took the box, filled it in secret, and returned it to Psyche, sealed. Psyche made her way back, once again bribing Cerberus and paying Charon, and she emerged from the darkness of the underworld back into the light of the living world, the impossible task completed. But as she stood on the path, so close to the end of her trials, a fatal human curiosity overcame her. She thought of her beloved Eros, and she longed to be as beautiful as possible for him when they were finally reunited. Surely, she thought, a tiny touch of divine beauty could not hurt. And so she carefully opened the box. But the box did not contain beauty. It contained only the dark, dreamless, and death-like sleep of the deepest part of the underworld. The Stygian sleep rose from the box like a dark cloud and enveloped her, and she fell to the ground as if dead. Meanwhile, Eros, his wounded shoulder now healed, could no longer bear his separation from his beloved wife. His love for her was stronger than his pride and his pain. He flew from his mother's palace in search of her, and he found her lying lifeless on the path. His heart broke at the sight. He gently landed beside her and wiped the cloud of sleep from her face, carefully gathering it up and placing it back inside the box. Then, to wake her, he touched her gently with the tip of one of his golden arrows. As her eyes fluttered open, he looked at her not with anger, but with a deep and forgiving love. He then flew directly to the throne of Zeus on Mount Olympus. He told the king of the gods the entire story, of his mother's jealousy, of his own accidental love, and of the terrible trials his mortal wife had endured for his sake. Zeus, the great king who understood the pains of love all too well, was moved by the story. He summoned Aphrodite and brokered a peace between mother and son. Then, he called for Psyche to be brought to Olympus. Before the assembled gods, he gave her a cup of ambrosia, the nectar of the gods, to drink. As she drank it, she was transformed, her mortality falling away from her, and she became a goddess, immortal and forever young. Zeus then officially and joyfully married Eros and Psyche, their love now sanctioned and celebrated by the heavens. Their wedding feast was a joyous occasion, a celebration of a love that had journeyed through darkness and doubt, and had emerged triumphant. In time, Psyche, the soul, gave birth to a daughter by Eros, Desire, and they named their child Voluptas, the goddess of pure and blissful pleasure. And so our story ends, not with a tragedy, but with a quiet and gentle truth, that the human soul must endure great trials and face its deepest fears, but when it is finally and truly united with love, the result is a joy that can last for all eternity. The gods of Olympus, in their perfect, ageless beauty, would often gaze down from their cloudy thrones upon the world of mortals. And what they saw was a world of fleeting, fragile beauty. They saw lives that burned as brightly and as briefly as a candle flame, and in that fleeting warmth, they saw a loveliness that their own eternal existence could not replicate. It was this fragile, mortal beauty that so often captured their divine hearts, and it was this fascination that led them to cross the great, shimmering boundary between the heavens and the earth. But when a god falls in love with a mortal, it is not a gentle rain that falls upon a thirsty field. It is a storm, a fire, a force of nature that reshapes the landscape of a human life, often leaving behind a trail of both breathtaking creation and heartbreaking destruction. The stories of these forbidden affairs are the stories of what happens when the eternal touches the ephemeral, and the soft, terrible agony of being chosen by a god. At the center of these tales, we find the king of the gods himself, Zeus. His love affairs are so numerous, so varied, and so famous that it would be easy to dismiss him as a simple, lustful philanderer, but to do so is to misunderstand his nature. Zeus was not just a king. He was the embodiment of the sky, of divine energy, of the creative, generative force of the universe. His desire was not just a personal whim, it was a cosmic impulse. When he fell in love, it was an act of creation, a way of spreading his divine essence into the world, of populating the earth with a new generation of beings who walked the line between human and God. But this divine impulse took little heed of the consequences for the mortal women who became the vessels for his creative energy. For them, the love of Zeus was a terrifying, life-altering honor, a divine storm from which they could not hide. Consider the story of Europa, a beautiful princess of Phoenicia, a land famous for its purple dyes and its great cedar trees. She was playing with her handmaidens in a meadow by the sea, gathering flowers and weaving them into garlands, her laughter as bright as the spring sunshine. Zeus, watching from on high, was captivated by her innocent grace. He knew that if he appeared before her in his true, majestic form, he would only terrify her. And so, he transformed himself. He became a magnificent white bull, a creature of such perfect, startling beauty that it seemed to have been carved from polished marble. Its horns were like a crescent moon, its eyes were as gentle as a summer sky, and its breath was as sweet as the scent of crocuses. The great bull walked calmly from the woods and into the meadow. The other girls screamed and ran, but Europa was not afraid. She was mesmerized by the creature's serene beauty and its gentle nature. She approached the bull, her hand outstretched, and it lowered its great head to let her stroke its soft, white brow. It licked her hands and knelt before her, as if inviting her to climb upon its back. Charmed and delighted, Europa laughed and decorated its horns with her garlands of flowers. Then, feeling a strange sense of trust, she playfully seated herself on its broad, strong back. In that instant, the bull rose to its feet and began to move. It trotted gently at first, then broke into a run, heading directly for the sea. Europa cried out in fear, clinging tightly to its horns as it plunged into the waves. But the sea did not resist them. The waves grew calm, and a procession of sea deities, dolphins, nereids, and even the great god Poseidon himself, rose up to escort them. The bull swam with impossible speed and grace across the wide expanse of the sea, carrying the terrified, awestruck princess far from her home. It brought her to the island of Crete, and there, beneath a willow tree, Zeus revealed his true form. He was no longer a gentle bull, but the mighty king of the gods. And there, on that foreign shore, Europa became his lover. From their union, 3 remarkable sons were born. Minos, who would become the legendary king of Crete, a ruler of such power that he would demand tribute from Athens itself. Rhadamanthus, whose wisdom was so profound that he would be made one of the 3 judges of the dead in the underworld. and Sarpedon, a noble king who would one day fight and die heroically in the Trojan War. The love of Zeus had brought a new royal lineage into the world, but it had begun with the terror and abduction of a young girl, a princess who would give her name to an entire continent, but who would never see her own home again. Or consider the tale of Leda, the beautiful queen of Sparta. Once again, Zeus was consumed by desire, and once again, he chose a disguise to approach his intended. This time he saw the queen bathing in a cool, clear river, and he transformed himself into a magnificent swan, its feathers as white as snow, its neck as graceful as a willow branch. To make his deception even more convincing, he had Aphrodite, in the form of a great eagle, pretend to pursue him. The swan, appearing to be in mortal terror, flew down and took refuge in Leda's arms. The queen, moved by the beautiful bird's plight, cradled it and protected it from the circling eagle. And in that moment of compassionate embrace, Zeus had his way. The consequences of this single, strange encounter would echo down through history and become the catalyst for the greatest war the mortal world had ever known. For Leda on that very same day also lay with her mortal husband, King Tyndareus, and from these two unions she produced two eggs. From one egg hatched the divine children of Zeus. The beautiful Helen, whose face would one day launch 1,000 ships, and the immortal hero Pollux. From the other egg hatched the mortal children of Tyndareus, the tragic queen Clytemnestra, who would one day murder her own husband, and the hero Castor. This mingling of the divine and the mortal in a single birth created a family of immense power and terrible tragedy. The beauty of Helen, a direct gift from her divine father, would become a curse upon the world, the spark that would ignite the Trojan War, a conflict that would see heroes die, cities burn, and the gods themselves choose sides in a bloody, decade-long conflict. All of this suffering and glory, began with the soft, white feathers of a swan and the deceptive plight of a god in disguise. The transformations of Zeus were not just a matter of trickery, they were a form of divine poetry. Each disguise was perfectly suited to the situation, a way of making his overwhelming power approachable, even beautiful. When he loved the princess Danae, who had been locked away in a bronze, underground chamber by her own father to prevent a prophecy from coming true, Zeus did not break down the walls. Instead, he transformed himself into a shower of golden rain. He became a gentle, shimmering cascade of liquid light that flowed through the cracks in the roof and pooled in Danae's lap. It was a seduction that was silent, beautiful, and utterly unstoppable. From this union of light and darkness, the great hero Perseus was born, the man who would one day slay the Gorgon Medusa and rescue the princess Andromeda. Here again, a forbidden love, a divine intrusion, produced a great hero who would bring order to the world. But for every hero born, there was a tragedy. For every story of a successful union, there was a story of terrible suffering, often brought about not by Zeus himself, but by the ever-watchful, ever-vengeful eye of his queen. The fate of the mortal women loved by Zeus was almost always a tragic one. They were the unwitting rivals of the most powerful goddess on Olympus, and Hera's jealousy was a force of nature in itself. As we have seen, she hounded Leto across the world, she tricked Semele into being consumed by fire, and she turned Io into a wandering cow, tormented by a vicious gadfly. To be chosen by Zeus was to be cursed by Hera. It was to be marked for a life of suffering, to become a pawn in a game of divine marital strife. The women were often innocent, their only crime their beauty, but they bore the full weight of the queen's wrath. Hera could not punish her all-powerful husband directly, so she poured out her rage upon the fragile, mortal vessels of his affection. This terrible power imbalance lies at the heart of all these stories. The mortal women, in truth, rarely have a choice. Their consent is, at best, ambiguous, a response to an overwhelming display of divine power, beauty, and deception. Can Europa truly be said to have consented when she was charmed by a magical ball and carried away across the sea? Did Leda consent when she was tricked into protecting a swan? Theirs is the soft agony of being chosen, of having their lives irrevocably altered by a force they cannot possibly comprehend or resist. Their beauty, which in the mortal world would have brought them happiness and a good marriage, becomes the very thing that undoes them. It is the quality that attracts the eye of a god, and in doing so, it seals their tragic fate. And the children of these unions, the demigods, were themselves often figures of great tragedy. They were caught between two worlds, possessing the strength and abilities of their divine parent, but also burdened with the fragile mortality of their human one. They were a paradox, a living reminder of a broken boundary. The greatest of them all, Heracles, the son of Zeus and Alcmene, lived a life of almost unimaginable suffering. His story is one of constant struggle, of being hounded by Hera's wrath, of performing impossible labors, and of fits of madness sent by the gods. He was the strongest man in the world, but he could find no lasting peace. His divine blood was both his greatest gift and his most terrible curse. The affairs of the gods were a fundamental part of the Greek understanding of the world. They explain the existence of heroes, the founding of cities, and the origins of royal lineages. But they also served as cautionary tales. They were stories about the danger of excessive beauty, the hubris of believing one could rival the gods, and the terrifying, unpredictable nature of divine power. They taught that the gods were not gentle or predictable beings. They were forces of nature, driven by passions that were as immense and as dangerous as a thunderstorm or an earthquake. To be noticed by such a being, to be singled out for love, was to be struck by lightning. It might illuminate the world for a brief, glorious moment, but it would almost certainly leave behind nothing but smoke and ashes. The love of a god was a fire that mortals could not hope to contain, a divine light that was too bright for human eyes, a forbidden affair that created the world's greatest stories, but at the cost of the world's most broken hearts. Not all love stories are about connection. Some of the most powerful are about its refusal. While Zeus chased his desires across the sky and Aphrodite left a trail of broken hearts in her wake, there was one power on Olympus who stood apart, a figure of quiet, silver stillness in a world of golden, fiery passion. This was Artemis, the eternal maiden, the goddess of the hunt, the moon, and the wild, untamed places of the earth. Her story is not about the love she gave, but about the love she denied, and the terrible, silent price the world so often paid for her untouchable heart. To understand her is to understand that the absence of desire can be a force as potent and as dangerous as desire itself. She was born on the floating island of Delos, a child of Zeus and the gentle Titaness Leto. She was the twin sister of Apollo, and she was born first. In the very first moments of her own life, her divine strength was so immediate that she was able to help her mother through the long and agonizing labor of delivering her brother. From her first breath, she was not a creature of helplessness, but a figure of strength, a protector, a midwife to her own twin. While Apollo would grow to become the god of the sun, of music, of prophecy, and of the ordered, civilized city, Artemis turned her back on the world of men. She found her home in the opposite realm, the dark, rustling forests, the lonely mountain peaks, and the wild, moonlit spaces where the rules of civilization did not apply. Her defining moment came when she was just a small girl, no older than 3. She climbed upon the knee of her father, the mighty Zeus, and looked at him not with the simple affection of a daughter, but with the clear, unwavering gaze of a goddess who already knew her own mind. Zeus, charmed by her precocious spirit, asked her what gifts she desired from him, the king of the gods. And Artemis, her voice clear and steady, laid out the charter for her entire existence. First and most importantly, she asked for the gift of eternal maidenhood. She asked that she never be forced into marriage, that she remain forever chaste, forever her own mistress, untouched by the passions and politics that consumed the other goddesses. Then she asked for a bow and a quiver of arrows, not made of simple wood, but forged from silver by the great one-eyed Cyclopes. She asked for a hunting tunic, short enough to allow her to run freely through the woods. She asked for a pack of the finest hunting hounds in the world, dogs with ears that could hear the wind and voices that could make the mountains tremble. And finally, she asked for her dominion. She did not want a golden palace on Olympus. She wanted the mountains, the forests, and the wild, uncultivated lands as her kingdom. And she asked for a retinue of 60 young ocean nymphs and 20 river nymphs to be her companions, her handmaidens and her fellow huntresses, all of them sworn like her, to eternal chastity. Zeus, looking at his fierce, independent daughter, was filled with a sense of pride and awe. He granted her every request, and in that moment Artemis was defined. Her chastity was not a passive state, not a simple lack of experience. It was an active, powerful choice. It was a declaration of sovereignty. In a world where female deities were so often defined by their relationships, as wives, mothers, or lovers, Artemis chose to be defined only by herself. She was a goddess of pure, self-sufficient power, as clean and as cold as the moonlight she commanded. To imagine Artemis is to imagine the deep, breathing quiet of a primeval forest at midnight. She moves through the trees not with the crash of a hunter, but with the silence of a shadow. The only sound is the soft padding of her hound's paws on the mossy ground, and the gentle rustle of her nymphs following in her wake. Her light is not the warm, revealing light of the sun, but the cool, silver, mysterious light of the moon. She is the protector of the wild things, the guardian of the young, suckling animals, the fierce defender of the sacred spaces of the earth that have not yet been tamed by man. And in a strange and beautiful paradox, this eternal virgin was also one of the primary goddesses of childbirth. Mortal women in the throes of labor would cry out her name, praying for a swift and easy delivery. For Artemis, who had helped deliver her own brother, understood that the line between life and death was at its thinnest during birth, and she offered her protection to those who traveled that perilous path. She was a goddess of contradictions. The huntress who protected the hunted, the virgin who aided in childbirth, a figure of serene, quiet stillness whose wrath, when provoked, was as swift and as deadly as the silver arrows in her quiver. The world learned of this wrath through a series of terrible, tragic tales, stories of those who, by accident or by arrogance, trespassed upon her sacred solitude. The most famous of these is the story of Actaeon, a young prince of Thebes and a hunter of great renown. He was a good man, a student of the wise centaur Chiron, and he loved the hunt with all his heart. One hot afternoon, after a long and successful morning of tracking, he wandered alone through the forest, seeking a cool place to rest. By a cruel twist of fate, his wandering led him to a secluded grotto, a sacred hidden place surrounded by cypress trees, where a clear, cool spring fed a deep pool. This was the favorite bathing spot of Artemis herself. And as Actaeon parted the leaves to enter the grotto, he stumbled upon a sight no mortal man was ever meant to see. There before him was the goddess, her divine form unclothed, her silver bow laid aside, bathing in the cool water with her attendant nymphs. The nymphs screamed and rushed to shield their mistress's body, but it was too late. Actaeon stood frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. He had seen the untouchable goddess in her moment of perfect, sacred vulnerability. Artemis looked up and her eyes met his. There was no fear in her gaze, no maidenly shame. There was only a sudden, cold and absolute fury. Her privacy, her very essence had been violated. She did not need to reach for her bow. Her anger itself was a weapon. She scooped up a handful of water from the pool and flung it in his face. And as the cool, clear droplets touched his skin, she spoke a curse, her voice as sharp and as cold as ice. "Now," she said, "you may go and boast that you have seen Artemis bathing if you can." A terrible transformation began. As the water touched Actaeon's head, great, branching antlers began to sprout from his skull. His skin coarsened and turned to brown, bristly fur. His hands and feet elongated into hard, sharp hooves. His neck grew long and slender, and when he tried to cry out, to plead for mercy, the only sound that came from his throat was the terrified, guttural bray of a stag. He turned and fled, his heart pounding with a new, animal terror. He caught a glimpse of his own reflection in a pool of water, and recoiled in horror at the beast he had become. But his torment was not over. In the distance he heard a familiar sound, the eager baying of his own hunting hounds, the very dogs he had raised and trained and loved. They had caught the scent of a magnificent stag, and they began to give chase. Actaeon ran, his new powerful legs carrying him swiftly through the forest he knew so well. But he could not outrun his own pack. They did not recognize their master in this new, terrified form. They saw only their prey. They closed in on him, 50 strong, leaping upon him, their sharp teeth tearing at his flesh. He fell to his knees, trying to cry out his own name, but only the sound of a dying animal came from his lips. And so Actaeon, the great hunter, was torn apart by his own beloved hounds, a tragic victim of a single, accidental glance, a terrible lesson in the price of witnessing a beauty that was meant to remain unseen. Not all who suffered Artemis's wrath were so innocent. In the story of Niobe, the queen of Thebes, we see the consequence of human arrogance. Niobe was a proud queen, blessed with 7 handsome sons and 7 beautiful daughters. She was so proud of her fertility that she began to boast, comparing herself to the goddess Leto, who had only 2 children. She publicly mocked the goddess, telling the women of Thebes to stop worshipping Leto and to worship her instead. This act of hubris was a direct insult to Artemis and her twin brother, Apollo. Leto, enraged, called upon her children to avenge her honor. From the heavens, Apollo, the god of the silver bow, rained down his deadly, invisible arrows upon Niobe's 7 sons, striking them down one by one as they practiced their athletics. Niobe, her heart shattered by the loss of her sons, still refused to repent. In her grief, she boasted that she was still greater than Leto, for she still had 7 daughters. And so Artemis, her face as cold and as pale as the moon, drew her own silver bow, and her arrows, as swift and as silent as moonbeams, struck down Niobe's 7 beautiful daughters. Niobe, now utterly broken, her 14 children lying dead around her, was transformed by her grief into a weeping statue of stone. her tears forming a river that would flow for all eternity. The story is a chilling reminder that the quiet, twin gods of the sun and moon were also gods of sudden, inexplicable death, and that to insult their mother was to invite a swift and terrible retribution. But perhaps the most tragic story associated with Artemis is that of Orion, for it is a story not of her anger, but of her affection, and how even that could be twisted into a source of destruction. Orion was a giant, a hunter of immense skill and strength, the only mortal man who could ever be considered Artemis's equal in the wild. They were not lovers. Theirs was a bond of deep, platonic respect and companionship. They would hunt together for days on end, their hounds running side by side, their skills perfectly matched. In Orion, Artemis had found a kindred spirit, someone who understood the silent language of the forest and the thrill of the chase. For a time, she knew a kind of happiness, a simple companionship that did not threaten her vow. But her twin brother, Apollo, watched this friendship with a growing sense of jealous concern. He was fiercely protective of his sister's chastity, and he feared that this close bond with a mortal man, however platonic, might eventually lead her to break her sacred vow. He saw Orion not as a companion for his sister, but as a threat to her very identity. And so, he devised a cruel and cunning plan to remove him. One day, Apollo saw Orion swimming far out in the sea, so far that his head was just a small, dark speck bobbing on the waves. He went to his sister, and feigning admiration for her skill, he challenged her. He pointed to the dark object far out on the water, and wagered that even she, the greatest of all archers, could not hit such a small and distant target. Artemis, proud of her unmatched skill and completely unaware of her brother's deception, accepted the challenge. She drew her silver bow, nocked an arrow, and with the calm, perfect focus for which she was famous, she let it fly. The arrow soared across the water, true and straight, and struck the target with deadly accuracy. A triumphant smile touched her lips, but as she watched, the waves began to carry the object back towards the shore. And as it drew closer, her smile faded, replaced by a look of dawning horror. It was not a target. It was the body of Orion, her friend, her only true companion, with her own silver arrow buried deep in his head. Her grief was as immense and as silent as the forests she loved. She wept over his body, her tears the first she had shed since her own birth. Her heart was broken, not by love, but by its loss. In her sorrow and her rage at her brother's trickery, she took the body of the great hunter and placed him among the stars. There he became the magnificent constellation of Orion, forever striding across the winter sky with his belt and his sword, his faithful dog, Sirius, following at his heels. It is a story of a love that was not a romance, but a deep and respectful friendship, a love that was destroyed not by its own passion, but by the fear and jealousy of others. It teaches us that even for Artemis, the goddess who refused love, the connections of the heart, in whatever form they take, can lead to unbearable tragedy. And so Artemis remains, an eternal figure of the wild frontier between civilization and nature, between love and solitude. She is a goddess of fierce independence, a protector of the vulnerable, and a bringer of swift, cold justice. Her stories are cautionary tales, warnings that some beauties are too sacred to be gazed upon, that some boundaries must never be crossed, and that some hearts are meant to remain forever wild and untamed. She is the quiet strength of the moonlit forest, a serene and silver presence that reminds us that there is a power in stillness, a danger in silence, and a love that can be found not in connection, but in the profound and peaceful act of being utterly, completely, and divinely alone. The world of the ancient gods was a world of light and shadow, and for every story that unfolded under the bright, watchful eye of the sun, another was born in the deep, silent darkness below. Our story now leaves the sun-drenched peaks of Olympus and descends into the earth, into a kingdom that all mortals, and even the gods themselves, spoke of in hushed and fearful tones. This is the story of the underworld, and of the strange and solemn love that blossomed in its eternal twilight, a love that would forever bind the world of the living to the realm of the dead. In the world above there was no goddess more beloved by mortals than Demeter. She was the great mother, the goddess of the grain, the harvest, and the fertile earth. Her presence was felt in the warmth of the sun on a field of ripening wheat, in the sweet scent of a summer meadow, and in the comforting weight of a loaf of freshly baked bread. She was a goddess of life, of nourishment, of the patient, steady cycle of growth and abundance. Her heart was as warm and as generous as the earth itself, and all the love in that vast, generous heart was focused on her only daughter, a beautiful, joyful maiden named Persephone. Persephone, known also as Kore, which simply means the maiden, was the embodiment of springtime. She was the gentle breeze that melts the last of the winter snow, the first crocus that pushes its way through the hard soil, the vibrant, youthful energy of a world reborn. She spent her days in the sunlit meadows of Sicily, surrounded by the beautiful Oceanids, the nymphs of the sea. She would run through fields of wildflowers, her laughter like the sound of a bubbling spring, weaving garlands of hyacinths and violets, her heart untroubled by the dark passions and jealousies that so often plagued the gods. Her bond with her mother was absolute. They were inseparable, a perfect picture of maternal love and maidenly innocence. The world was a garden, and they were its happy, peaceful keepers, but this idyllic world was being watched. From deep within the earth, from his dark and misty kingdom, another powerful god had laid his eyes upon the maiden of the spring. This was Hades, the brother of Zeus, the solemn and lonely king of the underworld. When the world had been divided, he had drawn the grim lot of ruling over the realm of the dead. His kingdom was a place of immense wealth, filled with all the precious metals and gems that lay hidden in the earth, but it was a kingdom without sunlight, without laughter, without life. His subjects were the idola, the silent, whispering shades of the dead, wraiths who had forgotten the warmth of the sun and the taste of wine. Hades was not an evil god, not a figure of punishment like some later cultures would imagine. He was a just, stern and powerful king, whose primary duty was to ensure that the dead remained in his realm and did not trouble the living. But his was a lonely existence. And as he watched Persephone, this creature of light and life and joy, a deep, aching longing grew in his silent heart. He fell in love with her, and he desired to make her his queen, to bring a single, living flower into his kingdom of shadows. He knew that Demeter would never consent to such a marriage, would never allow her daughter, the very essence of life, to be taken to the land of the dead. And so Hades, the grim king who so rarely left his subterranean realm, did something desperate. He went to his brother, Zeus, the king of the gods, and asked for his permission to take Persephone as his bride. Zeus, in a moment of difficult political calculation, found himself in an impossible position. He did not want to offend his powerful brother, the ruler of a third of the universe, but he also knew that Demeter's grief would be terrible. And so, he gave Hades not an explicit blessing, but a quiet, tacit consent. He would not help, but he would not stand in the way, and that was all the encouragement Hades needed. One beautiful spring day, Persephone was wandering in a meadow, a place so lovely that it was said to be a favorite of the gods. The ground was a carpet of soft grass, dotted with irises, crocuses, and wild roses. But in the center of the meadow, a new flower was growing, a flower of such strange and hypnotic beauty that it outshone all the others. This was the narcissus, a flower created by Gaia herself, as a favor to the king of the underworld. It had 100 blossoms on a single stem, and its fragrance was so intoxicating that it seemed to make the whole sky and the whole earth smile. Persephone, enchanted, let out a cry of delight and ran towards it. As she reached out her hands to pluck the magical flower, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. A great dark chasm suddenly opened up in the green earth, and from its smoky depths, a terrifying and magnificent sight emerged. It was Hades, the unseen one, riding in his golden chariot drawn by 4 immortal horses, as black as the night sky. Before Persephone could even scream, he swept her up into his arms, her cries of terror muffled against his dark robes. He turned his chariot and plunged back down into the gaping earth, the chasm closing over them without a trace, leaving behind only a few scattered flowers and the faint, sweet scent of the narcissus hanging in the silent air. The abduction was swift, violent, and absolute. The maiden of the spring had vanished from the world of light. Down, down, down they went, through the dark, secret passages of the earth, until they reached his kingdom. This was not a place of fire and torment. It was a vast, silent, and melancholic realm, shrouded in a perpetual twilight. Great, shadowy fields of asphodel stretched out in all directions, their pale, ghostly flowers nodding in a breeze that made no sound. The silent, fluttering shades of the dead gathered by the banks of the 5 great rivers that crisscrossed the land. The Styx, the river of unbreakable oaths, the Acheron, the river of sorrow, the Cocytus, the river of wailing, the Phlegethon, the river of fire, and the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, whose waters would wipe away all memory of life. At the gates of his great, dark palace stood Cerberus, the monstrous, free-headed hound, who would fawn on those who entered, but would savagely devour anyone who tried to leave. Hades led Persephone into his palace, a place of grim and silent majesty. He seated her on a throne of black marble beside his own, and he spoke to her not with the voice of a captor, but with the voice of a lonely king who had finally found his queen. He offered her all the wealth of his kingdom, all the power of his throne. He offered her his heart, but Persephone could only weep. She was a flower of the sun, and she was trapped in a world without light, her heart breaking with longing for her mother and the green fields she had lost. In the world above, Demeter heard the faint echo of her daughter's final cry. A terrible fear gripped her heart. She tore the veil from her head, her golden hair streaming behind her, and she began to search. For 9 days and 9 nights, she wandered the earth, taking no food or drink, not stopping to rest or bathe. She carried a flaming torch in each hand, searching every corner of the world, calling out her daughter's name until her voice was raw with grief. But no one, not God nor mortal, would tell her the truth, for they all feared the wrath of the 2 great brothers, Zeus and Hades. On the 10th day she met Hecate, the mysterious goddess of magic and the crossroads, who had also heard Persephone's cry. Hecate could not say who had taken the girl, but she suggested they go and ask the one being who sees all things that happen on the earth, Helios, the sun god. Demeter and Hecate went to Helios, and the sun god, his heart moved by the mother's desperate grief, told her the whole story. He told her of Zeus's secret consent, and of Hades's violent abduction. When Demeter learned the truth, her grief turned into a cold, burning rage. She felt betrayed by the gods of Olympus, especially by Zeus, the father of her child. And so, she made a terrible vow. She would not set foot on Olympus again. She would not allow a single seed to sprout from the earth until her daughter was returned to her. She abandoned her divine duties and began to wander the world of mortals, disguised as an old woman named Doso, her heart a barren field of sorrow. And as the goddess of the harvest grieved, the world began to die. The fertile earth grew hard and barren. The seeds that farmers planted in the soil refused to sprout. The fruit trees withered and dropped their leaves, their branches bare and black against the sky. The rivers ran low, and a cold, biting wind began to blow. For the first time the world experienced winter. Famine stalked the land. Mortals began to starve, their prayers and sacrifices to the gods going unanswered. The altars of Olympus were stained with no blood, and the smoke of offerings no longer rose to the heavens. The gods grew alarmed. The human race, which they depended upon for worship and honor, was in danger of being wiped out completely. Zeus sent Iris, the rainbow messenger, to plead with Demeter, offering her splendid gifts and a place of honor among the gods. Demeter refused. Then Zeus sent all the other gods, one by one, to beg her to relent. She refused them all, her answer always the same. She would not let the earth bear fruit again until she saw her daughter with her own eyes. Finally, Zeus knew he had no choice. The order of the world was at stake. He summoned his son, Hermes, the swift messenger, the only god who could travel freely to the underworld and back. He gave Hermes a direct command for their brother Hades. He was to release Persephone and allow her to return to her mother in the world of light. Hermes flew down to the Dark Kingdom and stood before the throne of Hades. He delivered Zeus's message. Hades listened, his face grim. He knew he could not defy a direct order from the king of the gods. He looked at his queen, Persephone, who had been sitting silently beside him, her heart still filled with sorrow. He told her, his voice gentle, that she was free to go, that she could return to her mother and the sunlit world she missed so dearly. A flicker of joy, the first she had felt in months, lit up Persephone's face. She rose, ready to leave at once, but then Hades did a very clever, very subtle thing. He said to her, "Surely you must be hungry after your long stay. Before you go, will you not eat a small morsel of food?" And he offered her a single, perfect pomegranate, its skin as dark and as red as a drop of blood. Persephone, in her excitement and her hunger, took the fruit. And she ate. Some say she ate only 3 seeds, some say 6, some say 7. The number did not matter. What mattered was the act itself. For there was an ancient, unbreakable law of the fates. Whoever consumed the food of the underworld was bound to that realm forever. They could never fully leave. Hermes then took Persephone in his chariot, and they rose up, leaving the kingdom of shadows behind. They emerged back into the world of light, and Demeter, seeing her daughter approaching, ran to her, her heart finally released from its prison of grief. They embraced, weeping with joy, and as the mother held her daughter once more, the world itself seemed to sigh in relief. The frozen earth began to thaw. The green shoots of new life pushed their way through the soil. The trees burst into leaf and blossom, and the sun shone with a new warmth. Spring had returned to the world. But as they spoke, Demeter asked the crucial question, "My child, did you eat any food while you were in the land of the dead?" And Persephone, with a heavy heart, confessed that she had eaten the pomegranate seeds. Demeter let out a cry of despair, for she knew what this meant. Her daughter could not stay with her forever. Because of this ancient law, a final compromise had to be reached, a new order established for the cosmos. Zeus decreed that for the part of the year corresponding to the number of seeds she had eaten, Persephone must return to the underworld. and sit on the throne beside her husband as his queen. For the rest of the year, she could remain in the world above with her mother. And so, the seasons were born from a mother's love and a mother's grief. Each year, when Persephone descends into the darkness to rule as the dread queen of the underworld, Demeter mourns her absence. She withdraws her favor from the earth, and the world enters the cold, barren months of autumn and winter. But each year, when Persephone returns, emerging from the ground like a seed sprouting into life, Demeter's joy is so great that she allows the world to bloom once more, and spring and summer return to the land. And what of the love story at the heart of this cosmic drama? It is a love that began with violence, with abduction, with possession. Hades did not woo Persephone, he took her. And yet the story does not end there. Persephone is not merely a captive in the underworld, she is its queen. She grows into her power, becoming a formidable and respected goddess in her own right. She is not the frightened maiden who was stolen from the meadow. She is the dread Persephone, the only one to whom the solemn king of the underworld shows any tenderness. Theirs is not a simple romance. It is a complex, mature bond forged in darkness and compromise. It is a love that acknowledges both the light and the shadow, the joy of reunion and the sorrow of separation. It is a love story that gives a slow, deep, and eternal rhythm to the world, a myth that teaches us that even in the darkest of places, life and love can take root, and that the world we know is built upon a foundation of both a mother's sorrow and a queen's return. There are some loves that are born in stillness, in the quiet meeting of two souls. And then there are loves that arrive like a wild, intoxicating music, a rhythm that enters the blood, quickens the heart, and demands that you lose yourself completely in its dance. Our story now turns to the strangest and most paradoxical of all the Olympians, a god who was both an insider and an outsider, a bringer of ecstatic joy and terrifying madness. He is the god of wine, the lord of the theatre, the breaker of chains, the god of the wild, untamed life force that flows through all things. This is the story of Dionysus, and of the love that can only be found in the blissful, dangerous act of surrender. His own birth was a story of love and death, of a passion so bright it could not be contained in a mortal frame. He was the son of Zeus, the king of the gods, and Semele, a beautiful mortal princess of Thebes. Zeus loved Semele with a fierce and tender passion, and he would visit her in the secret darkness of the night, his divine form shrouded from her human eyes. But their love was discovered by the ever-watchful Hera, and the queen of the gods, her heart filled with a cold and patient jealousy, plotted a terrible revenge. She disguised herself as an old, trusted nurse, and befriended the young princess. With words as sweet as honey and as sharp as glass, she planted a seed of doubt in Semele's mind. How could she be sure her lover was truly the king of the gods? Perhaps he was a monster, a trickster in disguise. The only way to know for sure, Hera whispered, was to make him reveal himself in his true, divine form, in all his glory as the Lord of Thunder. Semele, young and proud of her divine lover, fell into the trap. She made Zeus swear an unbreakable oath by the river Styx to grant her one wish, whatever it might be. Zeus, blinded by his love, swore the oath. And then Semele made her fatal request. Zeus begged her to reconsider, his heart filled with terror, for he knew that no mortal could survive the sight of his unveiled divinity. But an oath to the Styx cannot be broken. And so, with a heavy heart, he appeared before her. He was no longer a gentle, hidden lover, but a being of pure, elemental power, a living storm of lightning and celestial fire. The very air crackled with his glory. And Semele, in the face of this terrible, beautiful sight, was instantly and utterly consumed, incinerated by a love that was too powerful for her mortal body to contain. But as her body turned to ash, Zeus saw that she had been pregnant with his child. In a desperate act of love and preservation, he snatched the unborn infant from the flames. He then took the tiny, premature god, and cutting open his own thigh, he placed the baby inside, sewing up the flesh to create a second, divine womb. And so Dionysus was carried to term not by his mother, but by his father, nurtured by the immortal flesh of the king of the gods. When the time was right, Zeus unstitched his thigh, and Dionysus was born for a second time. This made him unique among the gods. He was the twice-born, a god who had known two mothers, one mortal and one divine. He was a creature of two worlds, a being who understood both the fleeting sorrow of mortal life and the eternal fire of the gods. This dual nature would define his entire existence. He was a god of the threshold, forever walking the line between joy and pain, between life and death, between sanity and madness. To protect him from the lingering wrath of Hera, Zeus entrusted the infant Dionysus to the care of the nymphs of a mythical mountain called Nysa. There in the wild, secret valleys and the deep, ivy-covered woods, Dionysus grew to manhood. He was raised not in the golden, orderly halls of Olympus, but in the untamed wilderness. His companions were not gods and goddesses, but the wild spirits of nature, the goat-footed satyrs, with their mischievous eyes and their love of music and pleasure, and the nymphs of the trees and rivers. It was here, in the heart of the wild, that he discovered his great gift to the world, the grapevine. He learned how to cultivate its fruit and how to press it, how to guide its fermentation, until it became the dark, magical liquid of wine. And when you drank it, you felt a new kind of power, a divine ecstasy that could dissolve the boundaries of the self and connect the drinker to the raw, joyful, and chaotic spirit of life itself. He was not a god who demanded quiet prayer in a stone temple. He was a god who demanded participation. His worship was not a matter of solemn ritual, but of ecstatic release. His followers were known as the Maenads, or the Bacchae, women who were seized by his divine spirit. They would leave their homes, their weaving, their families, and all the constraints of civilized life, and they would flee to the mountains. There, dressed in fawn skins, with wreaths of ivy in their hair, and holding the thyrsus, a long staff wound with ivy and topped with a pinecone, they would enter a state of divine frenzy. They would dance for days on end to the wild, hypnotic music of flutes and drums, their bodies moving with a freedom they had never known. In this state of enthusiasmos, which means the god within, they were no longer themselves. They were filled with the spirit of Dionysus, and they possessed supernatural strength and a complete indifference to pain. This was the gift of the god, a liberation from the prison of the self, a temporary return to a primal, ecstatic state of being. This new god, with his wild, emotional, and liberating form of worship, was a direct challenge to the established order of Olympus. He was the opposite of his half-brother, the cool, rational, and orderly Apollo. Apollo was the god of the lyre, of clear, harmonious music, of reason and prophecy and the well-ordered city-state. His temple at Delphi bore the inscription, "Know thyself." Dionysus was the god of the flute and the drum, of wild, chaotic rhythms, of the senses and the passions. His creed was not to know yourself, but to lose yourself. He represented everything that the rational, ordered world of men sought to control and suppress. And so, when he began to wander the earth, spreading his cult, he was often met with resistance. Kings and rulers saw him as a threat, a foreign god who encouraged women to abandon their duties, and who brought chaos and madness in his wake. But they would all learn, often in the most terrible ways, that Dionysus was not a god who could be denied. Our story of his love now takes us to a lonely, windswept island in the middle of the Aegean Sea. This is the island of Naxos, and on its shores, a young woman is weeping. Her name is Ariadne, and she is the princess of Crete, the daughter of the powerful King Minos. She has just committed the ultimate betrayal. She has fallen in love with a foreign hero, the Athenian prince Theseus, and she has helped him to kill her own half-brother, the monstrous Minotaur, who lived in the heart of the great labyrinth. It was her cleverness, her gift of a ball of thread, that allowed Theseus to navigate the maze and find his way out again. She has abandoned her home, her family, and her kingdom, all for the love of this hero, who promised to take her back to Athens and make her his queen. But Theseus, his great deed done, proved to be a faithless lover. On the journey home, he stopped at the island of Naxos, and while Ariadne was sleeping, he and his men slipped away on their ship, abandoning her, alone and heartbroken, on the deserted shore. She wakes to the sound of the empty sea, her heart shattering with the pain of his betrayal. She is utterly alone, a castaway, a princess with no kingdom, a lover with no beloved. Her grief is a vast, empty ocean. And it is into this profound silence of despair that a new sound begins to emerge. It is the faint, distant sound of music, of flutes and drums and wild, joyful singing. A strange procession is making its way along the beach. It is Dionysus, returning from his travels in the east, accompanied by his joyful retinue of dancing Maenads and playful satyrs. He is a vision of life and energy, his hair wreathed in ivy, his face flushed with wine and joy. He stops when he sees the weeping princess. He, the god who was born of sorrow, who was abandoned by his mother's death and raised in exile, looks at Ariadne, and he does not see a prize to be conquered. He sees a kindred spirit. He sees a soul that has known betrayal and abandonment, just as he has. He approaches her, not with the arrogance of a god, but with a gentle human tenderness. He listens to her story, and his heart is moved with compassion. He falls in love with her, not just for her beauty, but for her sorrow. He offers her not a fleeting affair, but an eternal love. He promises her that he will be a more faithful lover than the mortal hero who left her. He takes her by the hand, and he makes her his wife, his immortal queen. And as a wedding gift, a symbol of his eternal devotion, He takes the beautiful jeweled crown that she wears, and he tosses it up into the sky. And as it flies, it transforms into a glittering constellation of stars, the Corona Borealis, the northern crown, a permanent testament in the heavens to a love that was born from despair, a promise of redemption for a broken heart. The story of Dionysus and Ariadne is one of the rare, truly tender love stories of the gods. It shows the other side of the wild god, not the bringer of madness, but the healer of sorrow, the god of outsiders who finds love with an abandoned princess and elevates her to the heavens. But for those who did not welcome him, for those who resisted his power, the story was very different. The most famous tale of this resistance is that of Pentheus, the young, rigid, and arrogant king of Thebes. Thebes was the city of Dionysus's own mother, Semele, and the god returned to his homeland to establish his rights there. But Pentheus, his cousin, was a man of law and order. He saw the wild, ecstatic worship of the Maenads on the mountainside as a threat to his authority and to the moral fabric of his city. He saw it as nothing more than an excuse for drunkenness and debauchery, and he refused to recognize Dionysus as a god. He ordered his soldiers to arrest this strange, long-haired priest who was leading the women astray. Dionysus, who had arrived in the disguise of one of his own followers, allows himself to be captured. He is brought before Pentheus, and a great debate ensues. It is a debate between reason and faith, between control and release. Pentheus, full of rational arrogance, mocks the new god and his wild rituals. Dionysus responds with calm, enigmatic warnings, telling the king that he cannot imprison a god. Pentheus orders him to be locked in the dungeons, but Dionysus effortlessly causes an earthquake to shake the palace, and he walks free from his chains. But his true revenge is far more subtle and far more terrible. He sees within Pentheus not just a rejection of his divinity, but a deep, repressed curiosity. He senses that the king, for all his blustering, secretly longs to know what really happens on the mountain. And so, the god begins to play with the king's mind. He offers Pentheus a chance to see the secret rites of the Maenads for himself. The king, his curiosity now overpowering his reason, agrees. Dionysus then convinces him that the only way to spy on the women without being discovered is to disguise himself as one of them. And so, in a scene of profound psychological unraveling, the proud, masculine king allows the god to dress him in a woman's fawn-skin tunic, to place a wig of long hair on his head, and to put the sacred thyrsus in his hand. Pentheus, now completely under the god's spell, is led up the mountainside. Dionysus helps him to climb a tall fir tree that overlooks the clearing where the Maenads are dancing in their divine frenzy. But then the god's voice rings out through the forest, calling to his followers. "My Maenads," he cries, "I bring you the man who has mocked you and your rights. Avenge yourselves upon him." The women, their eyes filled with the madness of the god, look up. But they do not see a man. In their ecstatic state, the boundaries of reality have dissolved. They see a wild animal, a great mountain lion, perched in the branches of the tree, and with a terrible, unified cry, they rush towards it. The first to reach the tree is Pentheus's own mother, Agave. Filled with a god-given, supernatural strength, she rips the tree from the ground. Pentheus falls, and he sees his mother's face. The madness begins to leave him, and he cries out, "Mother, it is I, your son Pentheus, pity me." But she does not hear him, she does not see her son, she sees only the beast. And she leads the other women as they fall upon him, tearing him limb from limb with their bare hands in the ritual of sparagmus. And his mother, Agave, takes his severed head, impales it on the tip of her thyrsus, and believing it to be the head of the lion she has so bravely killed, she carries her gruesome trophy back to the city in triumph. The final scene of the story is one of almost unbearable pathos. Agave enters the palace, proudly displaying the head of the lion to her horrified father Cadmus. And then slowly, gently, as the divine madness finally drains away from her, her vision clears. She looks at the object in her hands, and she sees not the head of a beast, but the face of her own beloved son. A cry of recognition, of horror, of a grief so profound that it shatters the soul, is the true, terrible sound of the god Dionysus. It is the sound of what happens when the human mind tries to deny the powerful, irrational forces that lie dormant within it. To resist Dionysus is not to defeat him, it is to become the agent of your own destruction. And so Dionysus remains the most elusive and terrifying of the gods. He is a god of love, but his love is not a gentle comfort. It is a divine madness, an ecstatic release that demands the complete surrender of the self. He is Dionysus Lysios, the liberator, who frees his followers from the chains of their everyday lives. But this freedom comes at a price. It is the freedom of the storm, the freedom of the fire. His love is found in the wild dance under the moon, in the intoxicating sweetness of the wine, in the loss of control that brings you closer to the raw, beating heart of the universe. To love him is to be willing to be torn apart, only to be reborn as something new, something wilder, something more divine. His story is a dreamlight, intoxicating journey into the beautiful, chaotic, and loving madness that lies at the very core of life itself. Not all love stories are epic poems written in lightning across the sky. Not all broken hearts are the collateral damage of a god's careless passion. Some of the deepest and most sorrowful tales of love are whispered in the quiet, lonely places of the world, in the rustle of leaves in an empty forest, in the faint, sad sound that answers your own voice from a distant cliff face. Our story now moves away from the great tragedies of Olympus, away from the wars and the divine interventions, and into a quieter, more human landscape. This is a story of a love that could never be spoken, and a love that could never be touched. It is the tragedy of a voice without a self, and a self without a voice for anyone but its own reflection. This is the fable of Narcissus and Echo. In the green, sun-dappled mountains of ancient Greece, there lived a certain kind of nymph known as an Oread, a spirit of the hills and lonely grottos. And among them, there was one who was famous throughout the forests for her cheerful nature and her beautiful voice. Her name was Echo, and she loved to talk. Her conversation was a bright, bubbling stream of stories and questions and laughter, and her company was a delight to all who knew her. She was a favorite of the great goddesses, and even of Hera herself, the proud queen of Olympus. But Echo's greatest gift, her love of conversation, would become the instrument of her undoing. For she was not always wise in whose company she kept. She also befriended the great king of the gods, Zeus, and he, in his cunning, saw a use for her charming, talkative nature. As we have seen, Zeus was often unfaithful to his wife, and he would descend from Olympus to pursue the beautiful nymphs of the mountains and forests. Hera, ever watchful and ever suspicious, would often follow him, her heart filled with a cold and righteous anger. But Zeus, knowing his wife's path, would arrange for the charming Echo to intercept her. And Echo, perhaps out of a misguided loyalty to the king of the gods, or perhaps simply because she loved to talk to anyone who would listen, would engage the queen of the heavens in long, delightful, and distracting conversations. She would tell her stories of the forest, ask her questions about Olympus, and flatter her with such skill and charm that Hera, for a time, would forget her anger and the purpose of her journey. And in those precious, stolen moments, Zeus would conclude his affairs and slip away, his infidelity once again concealed. This deception continued for some time, but the queen of the gods was not a fool. Eventually she realized the truth. She saw that Echo's bright, endless chatter was not an innocent delight, but a deliberate and calculated trick. She understood that she had been played, her own authority held in contempt by a lowly mountain nymph. And her rage, when it finally came, was terrible and swift. But she did not strike Echo down. Her revenge was far more cruel, a punishment perfectly and poetically suited to the crime. She looked at the nymph whose voice had so cleverly deceived her, and she laid a curse upon that very voice. "Because your tongue has tricked me," Hera declared, her voice as cold as a mountain spring, "you shall forever lose the power to speak your own mind. From this day forward, you will never again be able to speak first. You will only have the power to repeat the very last words that are spoken to you by another." And just like that, Echo's world was shattered. The curse took hold instantly. She tried to speak, to plead, to explain, but no sound would come from her throat. Her mind was still filled with her own thoughts, her own stories, her own feelings, but the pathway from her mind to her mouth had been severed. She was a prisoner in the silent cage of her own body. The bright, bubbling stream of her conversation had dried up, leaving only a dry, empty riverbed. She could hear, she could understand, she could feel, but she could not express. Her greatest gift had been twisted into her most profound torment. Humiliated and heartbroken, she fled from the company of her sister nymphs, a shame too great to bear. She retreated deep into the loneliest parts of the forest, to live a life of silent solitude, her only possible conversation, a hollow mimicry of the world around her. At this same time, in another part of Greece, a child of breathtaking beauty was born. His name was Narcissus. He was the son of the river god Cephissus and the beautiful nymph Liriope. When he was born, his mother, worried about the future of a child so impossibly beautiful, went to the great blind prophet, Tiresias, and asked him a simple question. Would her son live a long and happy life? The old blind seer gave her a strange and cryptic answer. "He will," Tiresias said, "if he never knows himself." Liriope did not understand the meaning of the prophecy, but she held it in her heart as she watched her son grow. And as he grew, his beauty became a legend. He had hair as golden as the sun, skin as smooth as polished marble, and eyes that held the deep, quiet blue of a mountain lake. He moved with a grace that was almost divine, and his presence was so lovely that it caused hearts to ache. Nymphs and mortals, men and women, all who looked upon him fell instantly and deeply in love with him. They would follow him through the woods, leaving him gifts of flowers and fruits, writing him poems and singing him songs, all hoping to win a single glance of affection from him. But Narcissus's heart was as cold as his beauty was warm. He was possessed by a profound and unshakable pride. He looked upon the love that was offered to him not as a gift, but as his simple due. He saw the adoration in the eyes of his suitors, and felt only contempt. He believed that no one, not nymph nor mortal, was worthy of his love. He was an island of perfect, untouchable beauty, and he cruelly and casually rejected all who approached him. He would mock their affections, laugh at their heartfelt pleas, and turn away from them with a disdain that left their hearts shattered. He walked through a world that adored him, leaving a trail of weeping nymphs and heartbroken youths in his wake. One day, Narcissus was hunting in the forest with his companions. The chase was long, and he became separated from his friends. As he wandered through a quiet, secluded glade, calling out for them, he was seen by the nymph Echo. She was hiding among the trees, living her life of silent shame. But when she saw the beautiful youth, her lonely heart, which she thought had forgotten how to feel, was suddenly filled with an overwhelming, hopeless love. He was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and she was instantly and completely captivated. A new kind of pain now entered her life, the pain of a love that she could not express. She began to follow him through the woods, a silent, invisible shadow. She longed to approach him, to speak to him, to tell him of the love that was consuming her, but the curse held her fast. She could only watch him from a distance, her heart aching with unspoken words. She would hide behind trees and rocks, just to catch a glimpse of his face, her love growing with every secret glance. Finally, Narcissus, realizing he was truly lost, called out into the quiet forest, his voice clear and strong. "Is anyone here?" he shouted. From her hiding place among the trees, Echo's heart leaped. This was her chance. She could not speak first, but she could answer, and so she called back, her voice a perfect mimicry of his own. "Here, here." Narcissus was startled. He looked around but could see no one. "Come out," he called. And Echo, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear, replied, "Come out, come out." Narcissus, still seeing no one, called out again, "Where do you run from me?" And Echo's sad voice repeated his question back to him, "Why do you run from me?" Confused and intrigued, Narcissus decided to try one last time. "Let us meet together here," he shouted. For Echo, these were the most beautiful words she had ever heard. "Let us meet together here," she joyfully replied, and taking this as an invitation, she stepped out from behind the trees, her arms open wide, her face alight with all the love she had been forced to hold inside. She ran towards him, ready to embrace the beautiful youth she adored. But when Narcissus saw her, his face, which had been filled with curiosity, instantly twisted into a mask of cold, cruel contempt. He recoiled from her embrace as if she were a venomous snake. "Begone," he spat. "I would die before I would give you power over me." And with those terrible words, he turned his back on her and walked away. Echo stood frozen, her arms still outstretched, her heart utterly shattered. The only sound she could make, the only response her cursed voice would allow, was to whisper the echo of his final, cruel rejection back into the empty forest. "Give you power over me, over me." The humiliation was absolute. She had offered her whole heart, and he had crushed it with a single prideful sentence. She fled, her shame a physical weight, and hid herself in the deepest, most desolate caves of the mountains. And there she began to waste away. Her grief consumed her. She stopped eating, she stopped sleeping, she did nothing but mourn her unrequited love. Her beautiful body grew thin and pale, until it eventually faded into thin air. All that was left of her was her voice, and her bones, which, the story says, were turned to stone. And so, even today, if you call out in a lonely, rocky place, you can still hear her. You can hear the sad, disembodied voice of the nymph, who loved too much, and could not speak, forever repeating the last words of a world that has forgotten her. But the cruelty of Narcissus did not go unnoticed by the heavens. One of the many suitors he had rejected, a young man named Armenias, was so heartbroken by his scorn that he stood before an altar and prayed a desperate prayer. He did not pray for Narcissus to be harmed, but for him to be taught a lesson. He prayed to Nemesis, the stern goddess of righteous anger and divine retribution, and he asked that Narcissus be made to feel the same pain that he had inflicted on so many others. He asked that Narcissus be made to fall in love with someone he could never, ever have. Nemesis, the goddess who ensures that pride never goes unpunished, heard his prayer and agreed that the arrogant youth was long overdue for a lesson in humility. And so, one hot afternoon, after a long hunt, Narcissus was thirsty. Nemesis guided his steps, leading him away from the familiar streams and rivers, and deep into a part of the forest he had never seen before. There in a secluded, silent grove, where no shepherd had ever led his flock, and no wild beast had ever disturbed the grass, was a perfect, untouched pool of water. Its surface was as smooth and as clear as polished silver, a perfect, flawless mirror. Narcissus, tired and thirsty, knelt down at the edge of the pool to drink, and as he leaned over the water he saw a face looking back at him. He stopped, his thirst completely forgotten. He was utterly transfixed. It was the most beautiful face he had ever seen. He saw deep, soulful eyes that seemed to hold all the mysteries of the world, lips that were curved in a silent, perfect greeting, and a beauty so profound that it made his own heart ache with a longing he had never known. He did not realize that he was looking at his own reflection. He believed he was looking at a beautiful water spirit, a magical being who lived in the cool, clear depths of the spring. And in that moment, the curse of Nemesis took hold. Narcissus fell completely, hopelessly, and desperately in love with himself. He spoke to the beautiful face in the water, his voice soft with a tenderness he had never shown to anyone else. "I love you," he whispered. And the lips of the reflection moved, silently mouthing the same words back to him. He smiled, and the beautiful face in the water smiled back. He reached out his hand to touch the face of his beloved, but as his fingers touched the surface of the pool, the water rippled, and the image vanished. He cried out in despair, and when the water grew still again, the beautiful, sorrowful face returned. He was trapped. He was now the desperate suitor. He was the one who longed for a touch that would never come, for an embrace that was impossible. He now understood the pain of all the lovers he had rejected. He was consumed by a love for a being that was so close, yet forever separated from him by the thinnest, most impenetrable of barriers. He could not leave. He forgot to eat, he forgot to drink, he forgot to sleep. He simply knelt at the edge of the pool, day after day, night after night, gazing at the beautiful, silent face that gazed back at him, his heart slowly breaking with an impossible love. He would weep, and the tears of his beloved in the water would fall in perfect synchrony with his own. He would speak words of love and longing, and he would watch as the silent lips of the reflection moved in perfect reply. His once-proud body grew thin and weak, his golden beauty fading like a flower that has been cut from its stem. He knew he was dying, and as he felt his life slipping away, he looked at his beautiful, tragic beloved one last time. "Farewell," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. And from the woods nearby, a sad, faint voice, the voice of the nymph who had never stopped loving him, whispered his final word back to him. "Farewell," and with that his head sank to the green grass, and his life was over. When the nymphs of the forest, who despite his cruelty, still loved him for his beauty, came to retrieve his body to give it a proper funeral pyre, they found that it was gone. And there, on the spot where he had died, growing at the very edge of the water, was a new and beautiful flower that had never been seen before. It had a bright, golden trumpet at its center, surrounded by petals as pale and as white as snow. And they named the flower Narcissus, a permanent, beautiful reminder of the boy who had died for the love of his own reflection. And so our story ends. It is a quiet, sad fable, a story of a love that was doomed from the start because it could never connect. It is the story of Echo, who had a heart full of love but no voice to express it, and of Narcissus, who had a voice that all the world adored, but a heart that had no room for anyone but himself. Theirs is a tragedy born not of war or divine jealousy, but of the simple, human, and heartbreaking flaws of pride and fear. It is a gentle, sorrowful reminder that a love that cannot be spoken, and a love that cannot be received, are both destined to fade away, leaving behind only the sad, lonely echo of what might have been, and the beautiful, cold flower that forever leans over the water, gazing at its own perfect, unattainable heart. Our journey through the loves and losses of the ancient gods is now drawing to a close. We have walked in the quiet before creation, we have witnessed the birth of beauty from the sea foam, and we have felt the chill of a winter brought on by a mother's grief. We have listened to the stories that were once whispered in the firelight of ancient hearths, stories that gave a name to the thunder, a reason for the seasons, and a divine, epic scale to the passions that stir in the human heart. But as all ages must, the age of the gods too began to fade. The world grew older, and the human mind, once content to see a god in every cloud and a nymph in every stream, began to search for different kinds of answers. This is the story of that long, slow twilight, of the fading of the gods, and of the immortal legacy their love stories left behind, a legacy that is written not in stone, but in the stars above us, the earth beneath our feet, and the very language of our own souls. There was no single moment when the gods left. There was no grand departure, no final farewell from the peaks of Olympus. Their fading was a slow, gradual process, like a tide going out on a long, shallow beach. It was a change not in the heavens, but in the hearts and minds of mortals. For centuries, the myths had provided a complete and satisfying explanation for the world. They were not just stories. They were a form of science, philosophy, and psychology all rolled into one. They explained the natural world, they provided a framework for justice and morality, and they gave a name to the powerful, often overwhelming emotions that governed human life. But as Greek civilization matured, a new kind of thinking began to emerge, a way of looking at the world that was based not on divine revelation, but on human reason. In the bustling city of Athens, thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle began to ask new questions. They sought to understand the universe not through the allegories of myth, but through logic, observation, and rational inquiry. They taught that the world was not governed by the capricious whims of divine beings, but by natural laws and universal principles that could be understood by the human mind. This was the birth of philosophy, the love of wisdom, and it offered a new kind of power to humanity, the power to understand the world on its own terms. The focus began to shift from the heavens to the human mind, from the actions of the gods to the ethics of man. The great, epic tragedies that had once been seen as the result of divine intervention were now being re-examined as the consequences of human flaws, of pride, of ambition, of our own internal psychological struggles. This new way of thinking did not erase the gods overnight. The temples still stood, the sacrifices were still made, and the stories were still told, but their function began to change. They slowly transitioned from being literal truths to being powerful metaphors. They became part of a shared cultural heritage, a rich tapestry of stories that explained not how the world worked, but what it meant to be human within it. The Romans would later adopt the Greek pantheon, giving the gods new names, Jupiter for Zeus, Juno for Hera, Venus for Aphrodite, and weaving their stories into the fabric of their own vast empire. But the tide of history was turning. The rise of new, monotheistic religions would eventually offer a different kind of spiritual comfort, a different model of divinity, and the old gods of Olympus would retreat further into the realm of poetry and art. Their temples would fall into ruin, their statues would be broken, and their names would become the stuff of legend. It seemed as though they had left us, but they never truly vanished. For they had written their stories into the very fabric of the world they had once ruled. To see their legacy, we need only to lift our eyes to the night sky. The heavens are a great, dark storybook, and the constellations are the immortal illustrations of the gods' most passionate and tragic affairs. There in the cold, clear darkness of a winter night, strides the magnificent figure of Orion, the great hunter. His belt of 3 bright stars and the shimmering nebula of his sword are a permanent, beautiful monument to the only man who ever won the friendship of the chaste Artemis, a friendship so pure that it had to be destroyed by the jealousy of her brother. Following at his heels for all eternity is his faithful dog, Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, a symbol of a loyalty that even death could not break. Look again, and you will see the graceful, long-necked shape of Cygnus, the swan. As it flies down the river of the Milky Way, it is a silent, elegant reminder of the cunning of Zeus, a memory of the day he took on the form of this beautiful bird to trick his way into the arms of the mortal queen, Leda. And in that act he fathered the divine beauty Helen, whose face would one day set the world on fire. Not far away, you can find the constellation of Taurus, the bull with its angry red eye of the star Aldebaran. It is the celestial echo of another of Zeus's deceptions, the magnificent white bull that charmed the princess Europa and carried her away across the sea, a story of abduction and creation that led to the founding of a continent. And there in the spring sky is the gentle shimmering arc of the Corona Borealis, the northern crown. It is not just a circle of stars. It is the jeweled crown of the abandoned princess, Ariadne, tossed into the heavens by her divine husband, Dionysus, as a wedding gift, a promise that even the deepest heartbreak can be redeemed by a new and truer love, a love powerful enough to be immortalized in light. The gods may no longer walk among us, but their stories are there, every night, wheeling silently above our heads, a permanent map of their passions, their sorrows, and their betrayals. Their legacy is also here, on the earth beneath our feet. The very rhythm of our world, the great, slow-breathing cycle of the seasons, is, in its mythic heart, a love story. It is the story of a mother's grief. Each year, when the leaves begin to turn from green to gold and the air grows crisp and cool, we are reenacting the sorrow of Demeter as her daughter, Persephone, descends into the darkness to rule as the queen of the underworld. The cold, barren quiet of winter is the echo of a mother's mourning. And the first, tentative warmth of spring, the first green shoot that pushes its way through the frozen soil, is the echo of her joy as Persephone returns to the world of light. Our planet's annual journey from death to rebirth is not a matter of axial tilt, but a story of separation and reunion, a testament to a love so powerful that it can make the whole world bloom or wither with its passing. And in the small, beautiful details of the natural world, their stories live on. When we see a field of daffodils in the spring, their bright, golden trumpets leaning over a stream, we are seeing the legacy of Narcissus, the beautiful, cold-hearted boy who fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away from an impossible passion. The flower is a beautiful, sad reminder of the dangers of a love that turns inward. When we see the deep, purple-red petals of the hyacinth, we are seeing the tears of the sun god, Apollo, a flower that grew from the blood of his beloved friend, Hyacinthus, whom he had accidentally killed with a discus. And when we see the delicate, scarlet anemone, the windflower, its petals so fragile that they are scattered by the slightest breeze, we are seeing the grief of Aphrodite herself, a flower that sprang from the blood of her mortal lover, Adonis, a symbol of a perfect love that was cut down in its youth. The echo that answers our voice in a lonely place is not just a trick of sound waves. It is the faint, disembodied voice of the nymph who could not speak her love, forever bound to repeat the words of others. The world, for those who know the stories, is a living museum. Every flower, every season, every echo a quiet, gentle reminder of a divine passion. But the most profound legacy of the gods is not in the stars or on the earth. It is within us. The stories of their loves and losses have become the archetypes, the foundational patterns, through which we understand our own complex emotional lives. The gods never left us because they are us. Their stories are our stories, written on a grander, more epic scale. The turbulent marriage of Zeus and Hera, with its endless cycle of betrayal, rage, and reluctant reconciliation, is the archetype for every human relationship that struggles with the conflict between the desire for freedom and the need for commitment. The story of Aphrodite, forced into a loveless marriage with the brilliant but flawed Hephaestus, and finding passion with the dangerous and exciting Ares, is the eternal story of the conflict between security and desire, between the love we are supposed to want and the love our heart truly craves. The story of Hades and Persephone is not just a story about the seasons. It is a profound psychological drama about the nature of maturity. It is the story of a maiden who is violently separated from the protective innocence of her childhood and forced to confront the darkness, both in the world and within herself. She descends into the underworld as a victim, but she emerges as a queen, a being who has integrated the light and the shadow, who understands both life and death, and who finds a complex, mature love in a place of compromise and shared power. The story of Artemis is the story of anyone who has ever felt the need for solitude, for self-sufficiency, for a life defined not by a relationship, but by their own strength and purpose. And the tragic fable of Narcissus and Echo has become more relevant in our modern world than ever before. It is the perfect myth for an age of social media, of curated self-images, of people who fall in love with their own digital reflections, while the real world, like Echo, tries desperately and fruitlessly to connect with them. We no longer need the gods to explain why the sun rises or why the seasons change, but we still need them to help us understand the most powerful and irrational force in our lives, the human heart. We created these divine stories because the experience of love can feel divine. It can feel like being possessed by a force greater than ourselves, a madness sent from the heavens. Falling in love can feel like being struck by one of Eros's golden arrows. A broken heart can feel like a wound inflicted by a cruel and jealous god. A deep, abiding passion can feel like a sacred fire. By projecting these overwhelming feelings onto the great, immortal figures of Olympus, we were able to look at them, to examine them, to understand their power from a safe distance. The gods gave a face and a name to the chaotic, beautiful, and terrifying forces that rage within us all. And so, as our story comes to its end, we can let the gentle, ancient rhythm of these tales carry us towards sleep. The gods may no longer answer our prayers from their cloudy thrones, and their temples may be quiet, windswept ruins, but they are not gone. They are here, in the quiet of this moment. They are in the constellations that turn silently above us, in the memory of the flowers that will bloom in the spring, and in the deep, mythic patterns of our own lives. They are the echo in the lonely places, the sadness in a lover's farewell, the joy of a heart redeemed. They are the eternal archetypes of the human soul, and their stories are a gentle lullaby, whispered from the beginning of time, reminding us that our own small, fleeting lives are part of a much larger, much older, and much more beautiful story. A story of a love so powerful that it created a universe, and a universe so beautiful that it was, and always will be, worthy of a great and divine love.